Hey, welcome back. Imagine being controlled your whole life by your childhood friend, and that friend just happens to be an S-rank idol and the school chairman's granddaughter. One day, he finally snaps. No more obedience. No more leash. Just one goal: freedom and a normal school life. But escaping her won't be easy. A cold night enveloped the city. Thick clouds hid the moon, only occasionally letting through a faint light. The frosty air was thick with falling snow. Tiny Millie lay on the frozen ground and realized she was freezing. She had been left on the steps of a strange church, and snow was already dusting her blanket. She felt that her short life was coming to an end. With each passing moment, her cries grew quieter. Her thoughts returned to one thing. How could they have abandoned her, a 5-month-old baby, under the icy sky, with almost no chance of rescue? Her memory took her back to the recent past, a warm cradle, and in front of her, her parents arguing fiercely. Her father shouted that the child was not his, that the girl did not look like him. Her mother desperately argued the opposite. Millie had witnessed these arguments many times before. The heroine frowned slightly. It seemed that she had been reborn as a baby in this house, retaining memories of her past life. Waving her arms helplessly several times, she tried to count. About 5 months had passed since her rebirth. In the far corner of the room, a familiar maid stood humbly, watching the scene. Millie looked at her parents. Judging by their clothes and speech, this was a completely different world. In her past life, she had been an ordinary office worker from Japan. She couldn't remember the cause of her death. Her memories remained clear. A simple family and the life of an office lady who loved sweets from stores. Returning to reality, the heroine looked sadly at the arguing adults. It seemed that in this life, she could not count on her parents' love. Meanwhile, the man shouted loudly that his wife should not even try to impose a child from her lover on him. Then he stormed out of the room, slamming the door loudly. The maid flinched at the unexpected sound, and Maria crossed her arms discontentedly, watching her husband leave. Suddenly, she turned her gaze to the child. She muttered quietly that this hairless girl only disgusted her, and then angrily shouted at her not to dare look at her. Millie herself did not understand what was wrong with her head. She instinctively tried to look up, as if trying to see the top of her own head. Perhaps her mother's words meant that she was bald, which was quite strange for a girl. But what frightened her most was her mother's behavior, and the girl looked at her with concern. The main character thought that it was very reminiscent of postpartum depression. Maria crossed her arms over her chest discontentedly, wrapping herself more tightly in her shawl, and noted with irritation that the girl had cried only at first, and then strangely fallen silent, which looked very eerie. Because of this child, her husband began to suspect her of infidelity. She said bitterly that it was a cursed child. Millie frowned unhappily when she heard her mother's words. Maria looked at the girl with hostility once more, then casually turned to the maid Mary, briefly asking her to watch over her, and followed her husband. The girl nodded silently to her mistress. Meanwhile, the main character continued to reflect that even though she had memories of her past life and was perhaps deprived of her hair, she was still just a helpless baby in need of care and protection. Then Mary smiled kindly at the baby as she approached the crib. Leaning over, she gently announced that it was time to clean her bottom. The main character raised her fist, relieved that the long-awaited moment had finally arrived. Hygiene procedure. The maid carefully lifted the girl, gently hugging her, waved her hands smoothly, and uttered a quiet spell, concluding that the girl was now completely clean. Millie smiled happily. She thought how amazing it was. Just one movement, and all the unpleasant sensations instantly disappeared. Now she was absolutely sure magic really existed in this world, and it had been confirmed in practice. A sudden thought struck the main character that perhaps she herself could use these amazing abilities. Her eyes sparkled with excitement, and she immediately tried to repeat the maid's graceful movements. Standing tense and still, she concentrated intently on pronouncing the magic words. But instead of spell, only a gentle childish babble came out. The girl froze in bewilderment. Then, with a slight annoyance, she remembered that she still did not know how to speak properly or control her movements. Mary, noticing her restless movements, gently stroked her back and asked with concern if something was wrong. Millie, pressing herself against the maid's warm chest, thought with inner delight that this was indeed a completely different world, full of wonders. She eagerly imagined what amazing magic she would be able to master in the future when she grew up a little. Night fell. Millie struggled to open her eyes. She was breathing heavily and hoarsely. The girl realized that it was very difficult for her to breathe. She tried to scream with all her might. Maria was standing over her. Her face darkened with fear. At that moment, Mary was walking down the hallway with a lantern. She was approaching the ladies' room when she heard a child crying. The girl decided to go in and check. She carefully opened the door and asked what was going on. Mary thought it was strange, because the girl was usually quiet at night. What she saw in the room shocked her so much that she dropped the lantern. Mary called out loudly to the mistress, trying to get her attention. The woman, looking deranged, was trying to strangle the child. The maid rushed to Maria, held her back, and begged her to stop. She screamed for someone to come and help. Maria, her voice filled with madness, told the child that she could finally cry normally. She sounded like a dying animal. Millie continued to cry loudly out of fear. At that moment, the owner of the house burst into the room and sternly asked what was going on. Maria turned to her husband and muttered that the child was cursed and must die. While the lady was distracted, Mary quickly picked up the crying girl and moved away. She held her close and tried to calm her down. The next moment, Maria's face went blank and she fell unconscious to the floor. The head of the family sighed. He asked the maid to take the child to the church. Mary ran down the street. With each step, she moved further away from the estate where she worked. The girl was breathing heavily and looking around. She knew that no one should find out that she was from the Nazif Trading Company and that she must not be seen. She held the little lady tightly in her arms. The girl frowned discontentedly, thinking that she had been abandoned. Mary stopped at an abandoned chapel in the cemetery. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she looked at the child. With trembling hands, she wrapped the girl more tightly in a blanket and laid her at the foot of the monument, whispering silent apologies. Turning away abruptly, she ran away. Millie lay motionless, watching the receding figure. Large snowflakes fell on her face. The girl lay there and looked up at the sky. She thought her end had come. Millie looked around in confusion and saw snow-covered gravestones. She thought that no one came here. About 30 minutes passed. Millie raised her reddened and trembling hands to her head. She was overcome with panic. She could die from the cold. Would her second life end in 5 months? She didn't even know her name in this life. Everyone just called her ma'am. The girl began to cry even harder. She mentally begged God, if he existed, to save her right now. At the other end of the cemetery, a young couple was heading for the exit. But suddenly, a girl named Marissa stopped and turned back. Exhaling frosty breath, she told her husband, Joe, that she could clearly hear a baby crying. The guy put his arm around her shoulders and replied that it couldn't be. There couldn't be a baby in the cemetery on such a cold night. Marissa insisted that the crying was coming from there. The voices were getting closer to Millie. Hearing the footsteps, the girl thought she needed to give a sign. She screamed with all her might. Her strength was leaving her. Her eyelids were closing. In the last second before she lost consciousness, she noticed two vague silhouettes leaning over her. When she woke up again, all she felt was a deep warmth. She thought to herself that this might be heaven. Opening her eyes, the girl realized she was lying in Marissa's arms. Her husband, Joe, was standing next to her. Both of them looked at her with gentle, sympathetic eyes. The girl tried to look around. In response, the young people smiled even more warmly. Joe leaned toward her, and his voice sounded relieved. He said that they had despaired when they found her so cold and motionless, and were very happy when she finally opened her eyes. Marissa, meeting her confused gaze, smiled quietly. It was clear from the baby's expression that she was completely confused and didn't understand who these people were. Gently stroking the girl's head, Joe muttered thoughtfully that she must be about 4 or 5 months old. He couldn't understand how anyone could abandon a child in such a place. He silently thanked fate that he and his wife had visited the grave of their deceased daughter Lisa that evening. Marissa looked at her husband in bewilderment as he gently stroked the smiling child. Then she lowered her gaze. The next moment, she lifted the girl to her face, held her tightly to her chest, and turned to her husband with hope. She said she felt it was fate, as if their child had returned, and suggested keeping the baby. Remembering the baby clothes that were still stored in the house, Joe agreed. However, he cautiously added that this girl was not their Lisa. Marissa smiled with mixed feelings and quietly muttered that she understood. But she still felt that God had brought them together. And how could she leave such a cute girl? Joe wanted to lighten the mood, joked that the girl was strikingly bald and that it was unclear whether her hair would ever grow back. The main character was horrified to think that her fears had been confirmed. She really was bald. Marissa gently scolded her husband, saying that he shouldn't rub the child's head like that, and pointed out that the baby did have hair after all. Joe looked closely and agreed that the hair seemed to be light in color. The girl muttered thoughtfully that it was only baby hair, that it was too early to say anything for sure about the color. Joe then noticed that the baby needed a name. Marissa replied confusedly that there was no note on the clothes and asked if they could give the girl a name themselves. Her husband sat up straight and thought for a few minutes. Then he suggested the name Mariana. Marissa smiled and agreed that it was a beautiful name. So the girl became Mariana Spark. For short, She added they could call her Millie. The adults exchanged glances and, looking at the child, said with a smile that they were now her new mom and dad. Tears welled up in the main character's eyes. 4 or 5 months since her rebirth, she had been showered with angry shouts every day, and she had even nearly died. She silently thanked these people for saving her. Noticing her tears, the adults immediately became concerned. A few months after Millie was taken into the family, the Sparks opened a tavern called the Shady Cat Inn. It seems they bought it with their wedding money and connections. Joe was the son of an Edler who had been ennobled, having come from a commoner background. Marissa was the daughter of a wealthy merchant family. As she grew up, Millie reflected on the fact that her adoptive parents were both from wealthy families, yet got along well with ordinary people. Although she didn't hear much talk about their relatives. Either way, she hoped that the business would do well. But several years had passed since the opening. The situation remained unchanged. The rooms were dirty, and the food was unpalatable. The inn had too many problems, so visitors rarely came. When she was very young, Millie spent her time carefree. But she understood that if things continued this way, her whole family could end up on the street. The Sparks saved her life and raised her as their own. The girl was determined to repay them for their kindness. Thus began the life of Milliana Spark, whose mental age was 30, dedicated to caring for her adoptive family. Throwing up her hands, Millie mentally declared the start of her personal operation, repay with kindness. She would make the Shady Cat Inn prosperous. To start with, the girl decided to deal with one very dirty room, where there were stubborn stains, mold, and dirt everywhere. Looking at it, she muttered that this would not do. Suddenly hearing a strange sound, Millie turned around and froze in horror. A cockroach was lying next to her. The next moment, she opened her eyes wide and sat up in bed. Looking around, the girl muttered with relief that it was only a dream. But looking at her real, equally dirty room, she realized that it was true. She had to do something, and as soon as possible. After a while, Millie went downstairs for breakfast. All this time, she was thinking that she should start with cleaning. But how could she scrub off this ingrained dirt? Looking around the room, she thought that ordinary people in this world didn't really care much about hygiene. Judging by the few visitors, their inn was not the only bad place. But for her, accustomed to the standards of modern Japanese life, being in such filth was frankly difficult. No one even washed their hands properly. And this was both a hotel and a restaurant. If it became cleaner, there should be more visitors. These thoughts made the main character's head ache for a moment, and she grabbed her temples, suddenly bursting into tears. Her foster mother immediately rushed to her, asking excitedly what had happened. Marissa, trying to distract the girl, kindly remarked that she really did have very beautiful, light hair. These words had an instant effect. Millie stopped crying. Joe joined the conversation, sitting down at the table with his daughter. He explained seriously that there were many blondes among the aristocracy, and so that Millie would not attract the attention of any suspicious individuals, it would be better for her not to show herself unnecessarily in front of visitors or on the street for the time being. Marissa shook her head with a slight sadness, confirming that such hair color could no longer be hidden under a hat. These words filled the main character with horror. So, she wouldn't be able to help her parents in tavern? The girl thought hard. She had to come up with a way to improve her hygiene without appearing in front of people. How could she get clean quickly and easily? Suddenly, distant memories from her infancy came to mind. The maid and her former family used spells on her to make her clean. She remembered that this was a different world where magic existed. When Millie was a baby, she couldn't do it, but maybe now she could. Deciding to test it out, the girl waved her hand over her dirty plate and whispered the word clean. She froze tensely for a few seconds, staring at the dishes. Then her shoulders slumped helplessly. Nothing had happened. A bitter thought flashed through her mind. Her parents' magic seemed to work so easily, but hers didn't. There had to be some way. Millie got up from the table and said goodbye to her parents, wishing them luck at work. The adults smiled and waved back, and Marissa asked the girl to be quiet in her room. Climbing the stairs, the main character thought that she needed something, any idea. But no thoughts came. Nevertheless, she decided to try looking, just in case she found something. Even if it seemed pointless. Then she groaned mentally. Climbing to the 4th floor every day was exhausting. It would be nice to have an elevator in this world. Once in the room, Millie carefully searched all the cabinets. But she found nothing noteworthy. Nothing to be found just like that. With a heavy sigh, she turned away, thinking she could ask her parents, but she didn't want to bother them unnecessarily. Suddenly, she heard a slight rustling behind her. Turning around, the girl saw a small box, previously hidden by other items. The box looked very sturdy. Millie knelt down next to it and carefully opened the lid. Inside were various pieces of jewelry, rings, necklaces. But the only thing that really caught her attention was an old book. The girl picked it up and the thought flashed through her mind that it looked very much like a book on magic. She was delighted, so books like this really did exist. Next, Millie decided to try something like turning on a light. She scanned the pages and stopped, muttering to herself. It seemed she had found the right spell to create a light bulb. Her eyes sparkled with realization. For some reason, she could read all these strange letters. Apparently, it was a bonus from being reborn in another world. A couple of hours later, she finished reading the book. The gist of it was that magic required the activation of an innate magical power within a person, and to perform the action, it was enough to clearly imagine what you wanted. She froze for a second, concentrating. She wanted to try new desserts, especially those from a collaboration with a famous store, which she had pre-ordered from a 24-hour store in her previous life. There, she was literally obsessed with food. Closing her eyes, Millie immersed herself in vivid memories of those sweets. The next moment, she noticed that her hands began to glow softly. It seemed that this was the activation of magical power. Then the glow faded, leaving only a slight tingling sensation in her palms. The girl looked at her hands in confusion, mentally noting that the light had gone out, but now she definitely felt a new, warm power inside her. She raised her head decisively and muttered that now she thought she could do it. Exhaling heavily, Millie stood up, stretched her arms forward, and said loudly, "Light." And it worked. A small glowing ball hovered in the center of the room. Touching it with her finger, she noticed that it emitted a soft light, but was not hot at all, just like a tiny light bulb. Encouraged by her success, she summoned another ball, then several more. In her mind, she compared herself to the sorceresses of fairy tales. But suddenly, her vision began to darken, and her strength rapidly drained away. At the last second, she gasped weakly. She muttered that she wasn't feeling well before her consciousness began to fade. A few hours later, a voice calling her name woke Millie up. Opening her eyes, she saw Marissa leaning over her. The woman asked anxiously why she was sleeping on the floor, hugging some book. The girl sat up, rubbing her eyes, and wondered in confusion if she had really fallen asleep. Meanwhile, her adoptive mother picked up the book, gently pointing out that books were expensive and should not be taken just for fun. As she put it back in a box. Without paying much attention to her mother's words, Millie thought to herself. Perhaps her loss of consciousness was due to that very lack of mana. She only had enough strength for 5 small light bulbs. That was very little. Getting up from the floor, she folded her arms across her chest and realized with slight disappointment that she hadn't tried the cleanliness spell, but she felt that she definitely wouldn't have enough mana to clean the whole room. What should she do? The next morning, Millie decided to try yesterday's spell again. She summoned several glowing balls and froze in surprise. Yesterday, after 5 balls, she felt sick, but today everything was fine. It seemed to her that there was a little more magical power in her body. Summoning another ball, the main character thought that perhaps if she practiced every day, her mana reserves would gradually grow. A week later, at the reception desk of the tavern, Joe and Marissa were seeing off another guest. The doorbell rang. The woman told her husband that she was going to check on their daughter. She went up to the girl's room. Marissa called her name. From the doorway, she noticed that Millie was lying on the floor in a strange position, as if she were asleep. Quietly approaching, the woman picked up her daughter and muttered anxiously that she looked as if she had lost consciousness. To herself, she thought with concern that it looked frightening and silently hoped that it was not some kind of illness. After a while, Millie woke up in her bed, feeling rested. She sat up in bed and thought with annoyance that she had been caught again at a moment when she had passed out from lack of mana. She didn't want to worry her parents unnecessarily, so she needed to be more careful. As she had expected, her mana reserves were gradually increasing with each training session. Now, she felt normal even after summoning 10 glowing balls. So, she needed to keep going in the same vein. And so, day after day, unbeknownst to her adoptive parents, Millie diligently developed her magical abilities. Her parents would often find her in strange places and positions after another bout of exhaustion, take away her magic book again, which she would soon find again, and the girl herself continued to live happily with them. A few months later, the main character was already confidently using purification. She also mastered the basics of fire, water, wind, and earth magic. She felt proud. In a relatively short period of time, she had managed to learn how to use all the basic elements of this world. The book on magic said that those who mastered several elements were incredibly rare. Currently, only 5 people in the world are known to be able to control 3 elements. Millie mentally noted that everyone seems to have their limits. Perhaps that is why spells like purification are not used unnecessarily, so as not to exhaust all magical power at once. The girl assumed that her ability to control all the elements could also be a bonus of reincarnation in another world. But she was determined to keep it a secret so that those around her would not think she was strange. The main thing was that now she had the power to repay her adoptive parents for their kindness. She went down to the main hall for a short while, where the visitors were sitting at that moment. Marissa was serving them. Peeking around the corner, Millie realized that now was the perfect opportunity. Tying a scarf around her head to hide her blonde hair, she thought that her parents were too busy to notice her actions. That meant she had time, and it was time to get started. Going up to the guest floor, Millie immediately began to apply the cleansing to everything she saw, quickly tidying up the rooms. In a few minutes, she was almost done. There was only one room left, which she finished just then. Marissa appeared in the doorway, bringing her something to eat. The main character muttered with a bright smile that she had just made it and wiped her forehead with her hand. Her foster mother entered the room, announcing that she had brought lunch. Marissa froze for a few seconds, looking around in confusion. She said she didn't remember this room being so shiny. It was unnaturally clean. Handing her daughter a plate, she asked in confusion if she had cleaned it herself. Millie just shrugged, gratefully accepting the food, and said she had only helped a little. The woman looked around the room again, mentally noting that cleaning such a large area would be difficult even for an adult, even with the help of cleaning. Then she leaned over to the girl, patted her head affectionately, and said that she must be very tired, thanking her for her help. Millie nodded happily, accepting the gratitude, but thought to herself that this was only the beginning. She had only just begun to repay them for their kindness. She mentally noted that she could perhaps become a hero or a saint. Her reincarnation gave her every chance to do so. But in reality, she wanted only one thing: to live a happy life in this world with her new family. Millie sat at the table and ate her lunch. Her parents wished her bon appetit. Smiling outwardly, she stirred her spoon around her plate and thought that the food wasn't exactly tasteless, but she was tired of eating the same thing every day, and everything tasted bland. Now that she had tidied up the tavern and made it cleaner, she needed to come up with something for cooking. Joe, meanwhile, walked away from the table, humming something to himself. The main character finished eating and cleared her dishes. She thought that if she started cooking recipes from her past life, her parents would surely be surprised. She had even learned magic in secret, not wanting to disturb them. And yet, as she took the dirty dishes to the kitchen and thanked them for dinner, she thought that maybe she should tell them at least about the purification, and she could help openly. At that moment, Marissa entered the room and called the girl by name. With a slight but concerned smile, she asked her to come out to the backyard for a moment. Millie tilted her head in confusion, but followed her mother. The woman sat down next to a bucket and began mixing something. She said that her daughter's hair had grown noticeably longer, but remained the same unusually light shade. The girl looked at her silently, not understanding where this was going. Marissa continued, saying that she would very much like Millie to be able to go outside and play like other children as soon as possible. The next moment, Marissa turned to her daughter, smiling as she held a brush and a bucket of some strange dark liquid in her hands. The girl froze in horror, but did not resist. Her mother quickly dyed her hair, then walked away to wash the bucket, telling her to sit still for a while. Millie just nodded, sitting wrapped in a towel so as not to get dirty. She wondered if it was okay to dye her hair, but would everything be all right after this scary green liquid? She also worried that her hairstyle would look too fancy or strange. After a while, Marissa helped her daughter wash her hair thoroughly and said with satisfaction that everything was fine now. Then she asked Millie if she liked the result. The girl looked admiringly at her hair, which was now a beautiful reddish brown, just like her mother's. Marissa poured the dirty water down the drain and announced with a smile that starting tomorrow, her daughter could begin meeting the neighbors. Millie smiled happily and thanked her. The next day, Millie and her mother went out to meet the neighbors and get to know the other children, who were also with their parents. Marissa introduced two of them, Mike from the sewing shop next door and Nina from the butcher shop. Both children greeted the main character politely. The girl responded by saying her name and, shaking Nina's hand, said she was very pleased to meet her. To herself, she thought happily that these neighborhood children could become her first friends. Mike then asked if Millie liked sweets. She replied that she absolutely loved them. The boy smiled broadly and said that since they were now friends, he would take her to a special place. The main character asked curiously what kind of place it was. After a while, they found themselves in a place where many apple trees grew. Millie looked around in admiration. Her new friends watched her delight with pleasure. Mike picked up one of the apples and explained that in the city, such fruit costs 5 copper coins, but here in the forest, you can pick as many as you want for free. Nina, with a sweet but serious smile, clarified that this forest is considered dangerous, so they always go there only with adults. Hearing about the price, Millie remembered how her adoptive father, Joe, explained the monetary system to her. An iron coin is worth 10 yen, a small copper coin is worth 100 yen, a copper coin is worth 1,000 yen, a silver coin is worth 10,000 yen, a small gold coin is worth 100,000 yen, and a gold coin is worth 1 million yen. She mentally calculated that one apple cost about 500 yen. It turned out to be very expensive. Carried away by her calculations, she strayed a little from her companions, and they immediately called her back. When she approached, Mike suggested a competition to see who could collect the most apples. Millie, unlike the other children, was not thinking about the game, but about the profit. Picking apples for free at 500 yen apiece was a great opportunity. However, she wondered if they would be able to eat so many. As she picked the fruit, she remembered how she often baked apples in her past life. A little later, she returned home with a full basket and decided to suggest to her parents that they prepare a dish from her past experience. This suggestion greatly surprised the adults. The main character explained that she wanted to bake the apples and call it apple chips. Joe just laughed in response, noting that if you put such juicy apples in a hot oven, they would simply spoil and turn into mush. The girl flashed her eyes defiantly and asked if her father was sure about that. Then she leaned in close and declared that the most important thing in cooking was not to be afraid of failure. To be honest, she wondered whether she should reveal her knowledge of dishes from her past life that did not exist in this world. But every day was the same, milk soup or vegetable soup, and she wanted something sweet so badly. Since her rebirth, she hadn't had a single normal snack. And once the idea came to her, she couldn't let it go. Sitting next to her parents, she thought that her family was not the type to find it strange. Memories of her past life, her ability to control all the elements, it all seemed too incredible, and she wasn't going to talk about it. But Millie didn't want to keep absolutely everything from her parents. Joe smiled, sighed, and nodded, agreeing to try his daughter's recipe. He had already reached for an apple when Millie stopped him. The next moment, she used cleansing on her parents' hands. The adults watched their daughter's actions with wide eyes. Joe, pausing for a moment, asked how she was able to use magic. The main character frowned slightly and replied firmly and directly. She had been practicing while her parents were at work. Marissa looked at her daughter silently and very intently. Then her face lit up with realization. She approached her daughter and asked with interest if her room had been so clean lately because she had used magic to clean it. Millie nodded tensely, thinking to herself that it was better not to mention how large an area she had actually tidied up. Meanwhile, Joe began to recover from the shock. With trembling hands and stammering, he said that his daughter, without any training and at such a young age. Then his face literally lit up, and he put his hand to his mouth and exclaimed, "Could she be a genius?" At this phrase, the main character froze in confusion. She wondered why her parents had accepted all this so easily. The adults, not noticing her confusion, began to discuss excitedly that she had been looking at a book on magic. Maybe she could even read. Then they both turned to the girl and, with serious but warm excitement, asked her to be careful and not use too much magic, because magical power could also run out. Marissa nodded in agreement and added that the girl was only 4 years old. Millie smiled at them both. She mentally noted that, even though her parents were a little frivolous, she liked them very much. She could be herself around them as much as possible. Out loud, she simply agreed happily with their words. Her next move was to use cleansing on the fruit. Then she solemnly announced that it was time to start making apple chips. First, she had to thinly slice the apples, then put them in the oven to bake, carefully adjusting the temperature so they wouldn't burn. As soon as the slices became crispy, they could be taken out and tasted. With a happy expression on her face, Millie took the finished apple chips out of the oven and announced that the cooking was complete. Joe looked at the snack with interest and noted that it smelled good. Marissa added that she couldn't wait to try them. Then everyone took a piece. For a few seconds, there was a tense silence. After that, the adults' faces literally lit up with delight. The apples were incredibly delicious, so crispy that it was easy to get addicted to them. Joe turned to his daughter and asked if she had gotten what she wanted. The girl couldn't say a word. She was almost crying with happiness because she hadn't eaten anything sweet in so long. With sparkling eyes and the most serious expression on her face, she said that her dad was the best and gave him a thumbs up. Joe just looked puzzled at this strange gesture, but decided not to dwell on it. Then Millie, stammering a little, suggested, "What if we treat the tavern visitors to these apple chips?" The adults exchanged glances and nodded in agreement. They decided they would definitely try it tomorrow. The next day, Marissa followed her daughter's suggestion and offered the puzzled visitors a new treat. They cautiously tried the apple chips and froze in delight. One of them exclaimed that they were incredibly crispy and delicious, and the second immediately asked for more. Millie watched the scene from around the corner. She thought that perhaps she could use other knowledge from her past life for cooking. But apple chips were just a snack. She wanted to come up with a real dish that could become the signature dish of their tavern. After a while, her father approached the main character and announced with a broad smile that her apple chips were a huge hit with the guests. And as a reward, she deserved a real steak. Seeing the appetizing piece of meat in front of her, the girl froze in admiration. Cutting off a piece and tasting it, she mentally moaned with pleasure. And she noted that it seemed that pork also existed in this world. Joe, noticing her expression, asked with satisfaction if orc meat was really incredibly delicious, and Millie automatically nodded in agreement. But in the next second, she froze, realizing what her father had just said. Her father, not noticing her hesitation, just joked that if she didn't eat quickly, the steak would get cold. Meanwhile, an image popped in her mind. A large, pig-like creature standing on its hind legs and clutching a crude weapon in its hands. Apparently, this was the same orc she often encountered in games, and she had just eaten one of those. Tears welled up in her eyes, and Joe immediately became concerned, asking what was wrong. The main character didn't answer, lost in her thoughts. She mentally thanked the orc for his sacrifice and decided she would eat the meat with gratitude. It was so delicious that it was hard to stop, even though the familiar image of the orc from the games kept popping into her head. Then the girl suddenly froze. A new thought dawned on her. If there was pork in this world, or at least orc meat, then she would be able to cook that very dish. That meant she could make that very dish. Tonkatsu, crispy on the outside, juicy on the inside. When you bite into it, the meat seems to melt in your mouth. It's just devilishly delicious. Of course, these were just her assumptions, but if you fry such meat in hot oil, it seems like something incredible will happen. She immediately suggested to her father that he add this new dish to the menu. Joe stood opposite her, arms crossed over his chest, and skeptically suggested that frying meat in oil was a waste of a precious resource. Millie immediately called out to him menacingly, her eyes flashing. She asked what was most important in cooking. Her father just chuckled awkwardly and, now much more enthusiastic, repeated her words. A fearless heart that is not afraid of failure. The apple chips turn out great, so why not give it a try? A little later in the kitchen, the main character listed everything she needed: eggs, flour, bread, orc meat, salt, and spices. It was good that flour and seasonings also existed in this world. Joe stood slightly behind her. He asked with some doubt if she was sure she had remembered everything correctly, and how exactly she was going to cook it. The girl just smiled broadly in response, and assured him that everything was fine. First, she had to make small cuts in the thinly sliced pieces of orc meat so that they would not deform when fried, then sprinkle them with salt and spices. After that, the meat had to be rolled in flour and dip it in beaten egg. At this point, Joe couldn't take it anymore and exclaimed indignantly that it was a real waste to use precious ingredients like that. Millie, slightly annoyed, asked him to just watch and not interfere. Then she grated the bread to make breadcrumbs and carefully coated each piece of meat in it. Standing on a small stool and holding a bottle of oil in her hands, the main character asked her father to turn up the heat. Joe asked in horror, "Are you really going to fry all this in oil?" And when the girl unhesitatingly poured much more oil into the pan than he thought reasonable, he almost jumped up, shouting that it was an unacceptable waste of precious ingredients. Millie completely ignored his exclamations. She carefully lowered the breaded pieces of meat into the boiling oil. She explained that it needed to be fried well on all sides, and when an even golden crust appeared, the dish would be ready. Then she took out the finished orkatsu and placed it on a plate. With a triumphant look, she handed it to her father, inviting him to try it while it was still hot. Joe looked at the dish with some doubt and sniffed it. Then he carefully cut a piece and tasted it. His face immediately lit up, and he exclaimed that it was really delicious. He thought it would turn out strange with the egg and breading, but it turned out quite well. Millie took a bite with delight. Inside, she was rejoicing. This was real tonkatsu from her past life, and she was incredibly happy. However, in the next moment, her face clouded over. She frowned and muttered discontentedly that something was missing. Her father was surprised because it tasted perfectly fine, but the girl crossed her arms over her chest and said with disappointment that it wasn't tonkatsu. Joe asked what she was talking about, but the main character was already deep in thought. What was wrong? The meat didn't seem juicy enough, and the texture wasn't quite right. Thoughtfully, she muttered that perhaps if it were fried twice, the meat would become crispier. Then she looked seriously at her father and said that they would definitely try it again tomorrow. The man, finishing his piece, said that he had already considered adding this orkatsu to the menu as a new item. But, noticing her dissatisfied expression, he sighed and promised not to do so until she was completely satisfied with the result. He would help her experiment. Millie beamed at these words and brightly asked if he would help her experiment. He sighed and promised not to do so until she herself was completely satisfied with the result. He would help her experiment. Millie beamed at these words and thanked her father wholeheartedly. Since then, they have been searching for the perfect orkatsu recipe every day and trying new things. Test sample number 2. The meat was cut too thick and remained raw inside. Test sample number 3. The oil temperature was too high and the meat burned. Test sample number 4. The breading fell off and the meat itself was tough. At one point, Millie became completely discouraged. She wondered why it was getting worse each time, since the very first orkatsu was so much better. She was sitting there, immersed in self-flagellation, when her father found her. He looked at his upset daughter with a gentle, understanding smile, sighed quietly, and approached her. He stroked her head and asked her what was most important in cooking. The main character turned to him with tears in her eyes and, stammering slightly, said that it was a fearless heart that was not afraid of failure. The man smiled broadly at her own words, put his hands on his hips, and said firmly that since she herself had taught him this motto, they would definitely manage together. So there was no need to be discouraged. Then he walked over to the table and, with renewed enthusiasm, began to rub bread for fresh breading, preparing for the next attempt. Millie looked at his cheerful back and thought that even if he didn't fully believe in her childish ideas about cooking, he was still willing to try again and again. And that's why she had to stand her ground. She had to make a dish that everyone at the Shady Cat Inn would love. Millie decided to review her past failures and analyze where and what she had done wrong. The first and most important thing was the thickness of the meat. It shouldn't be cut too thin, but it had to be easy to bite into. She watched thoughtfully as her father cut the meat and corrected him, thicker or thinner. The second thing was adjusting the oil temperature. The ideal temperature should have been around 170 degrees. Joe, heating the oil, asked if it was okay. Millie nodded in agreement, then put a small pot on her head like a helmet and covered herself with one of the lids. Her father, sensing her mood, also covered himself with a lid as a shield and carefully lowered a piece of meat into the oil. It immediately began to splatter in all directions, and a few drops landed on his hand. He cried out in surprise. The main character shouted that the breading was starting to slide off a little and that maybe they should turn down the heat. Her father nodded in agreement and, still wary of the hot splashes, carefully did as she asked. Their goal was simple, to brown the meat a little by frying it at a constant, not too high temperature. The third goal was to improve the breadcrumbs. They needed to be fine and crumbly, and it was important not to make a mistake with the size. To do this, they called on Marissa's magic for help. She gladly joined in the process. She carefully used her magic to dry and grind the breadcrumbs, asking her daughter every now and then if the result was satisfactory. Millie watched her actions with shining eyes and finally nodded with satisfaction. Once the perfect breadcrumbs were ready, the prepared meat could be carefully coated in them. The fourth step was choosing the most suitable oil for frying. Millie had several bottles of different oils in front of her. Joe smiled slightly and remarked that during their numerous attempts, he had managed to buy almost everything he could at the market. The girl raised her fist enthusiastically, thanked him, and suggested that they test each of the oils as soon as possible. After some trial and error, they found a perfect oil. Joe carefully removed the already fried pieces from the hot oil, explaining that now they needed to let it cool down a little and then fry it again. The result was crispy on the outside, but still too raw on the inside. Then, with some pride, he showed his daughter the new cutlery and asked if these chopsticks would be suitable. Millie picked them up and said with admiration that they were just perfect. So they moved on to the fifth step, making cutlery. It turned out that in this world, quality kitchen utensils cost a lot of money. And when the main character casually mentioned chopsticks, her father decided to make them for her himself. However, he couldn't quite figure out the shape she was used to, not seeing how they could be used. So in the end, they agreed on a shape resembling tongs for coals, more convenient and understandable for him. And so, attempt, after long hours of reflection, trial and error, tedious work, and falling asleep right in the kitchen from exhaustion, they finally succeeded. The perfect orkatsu she had dreamed of. Finally, the day of the new dish's presentation arrived. The guests began to descend into the common room and were immediately greeted by an incredible, tantalizing smell coming from a kitchen. The guests involuntarily began to look in that direction, and then Marissa approached them, carrying trays with neatly arranged portions. With a light, businesslike smile, she announced the new dish had appeared on the tavern's menu today. The Shady Cat in signature orkatsu. Just looking at the plates, some of the guests involuntarily swallowed. One of them even asked if it was really orc meat in front of him. Still a little doubtful, they poked at the crispy breading with their forks. But succumbing to the tempting aroma, they decided to try it. The entire Spark family held their breath as they watched their reaction. Millie froze in suspense. Would they really say nothing? Surely they had to like this dish. The next second, the room erupted with enthusiastic exclamations. The guests praised the dish, how juicy and crispy it was, how incredibly delicious the meat was cooked, and how it was simply impossible to stop eating. They all liked it so much that many immediately asked for seconds. Millie and her parents exchanged glances, and at the same time, as if on cue, they clapped their hands, whispering happily to each other about how well it had turned out. Watching Marissa bring out second and even third servings to some, the girl thought it was a great sign. If Orkatsu became popular, their tavern would definitely get more visitors. The following week, the main character struggled to get up in the morning and, still sleepy, went down for breakfast. After wishing everyone a good morning, she took a plate from her smiling father and sat down at the table. Joe noticed with slight confusion that there was unusual noise outside since early morning. He decided to go and see what was going on, while his daughter and wife watched him with mild curiosity. Shrugging their shoulders, they both returned to their food, although Marissa still asked if something had happened. Suddenly, there was a scream. An agitated Joe ran into the room, announcing that something terrible had happened. Millie and her mother looked out the window and froze in shock. A huge queue of several dozen people had gathered at the door of their tavern, far more than ever before. The entire Spark couple went outside and froze on the doorstep, stunned by the scene before them. Millie involuntarily exclaimed, asking what was going on. Noticing his daughter's concern, Joe approached the nearest person in line, who turned out to be a seasoned adventurer, and asked him the same question. The man, with a broad, good-natured smile, explained that the food at their tavern had become a legend among adventurers. Rumor had it that you could try an unheard-of dish made from orc meat, which no one had ever cooked before. He wanted to try it so badly that he came first thing in the morning, and there was already a long line. These words made the main character cheer inwardly. She couldn't believe that in just a week, the rumors had spread so quickly. It was incredible luck. Then Millie resolutely called out to her parents, clenching her small hands into fists. She met their puzzled looks. She firmly stated that this was their long-awaited chance. Now, they couldn't waste a minute, and under no circumstances could they give up. She suggested that they finally bring the tavern to life. Marissa and Joe exchanged glances. Their daughter's determination rubbed off on them. They both nodded, and the same sparkle lit up in their eyes. Their mother took Millie by the hand and almost ran inside to start preparations, while Joe remained at the entrance. He announced loudly to the crowd that everyone would be served, but they would have to wait a little while for their turn. Since then, the stream of visitors has not stopped for a single day. There was not a moment's rest in the tavern, and Millie worked alongside the adults, helping in any way she could. Those were very stressful but incredibly eventful days. And on one such evening, all three sat in silence in the kitchen after closing the tavern. Joe groaned as he struggled to straighten his back and admitted that he couldn't remember when he had been so tired all week. Marissa gave him a cup of hot tea with a reassuring smile, gently noting that they had indeed worked hard today. The man nodded gratefully. Taking a sip, he admitted that he never thought his daughter's invention, Orkatsu, would become so popular. Therefore, despite his fatigue, he had no complaints. The main character laughed awkwardly and agreed that she was also surprised. But her eyes sparkled with determination. This was only the first step. Then she cautiously turned to her father, apologizing for bothering him when he was so tired. And she began to list other ideas: fried chicken with salt and lemon, dumplings with fish sauce instead of soy sauce, hamburg steak, and orc ginger, orc meat fried with ginger. After all, there were so many of her favorite dishes from her past life that they could try to cook. Joe, even though he was exhausted, listened to her, then sighed heavily and smiled, agreeing that they could try. Millie immediately exclaimed that he was the best. Just as with Orkatsu, they began to cook trial versions of new dishes, refining the taste day after day. The main character reasoned that if they only served Orkatsu every day, their establishment would very quickly become a one-hit wonder. And their real goal was to get regular customers. Smiling resolutely to herself, she thought that they could develop a whole new menu. This perhaps was the advantage of being 30 years old mentally, the ability to look at things strategically. Some time later, again at dinner, the girl approached her parents with a new idea. What if they added all these new dishes to the menu and offered them as part of a delicious set meal of the day? The adults looked at each other and agreed that it was an excellent idea. Then Joe, slightly surprised, asked how such ideas even came to her mind. Millie cheerfully threw her hands up, exclaiming that it just came naturally. Marissa watched them with a warm smile. Then the main character stared thoughtfully at the table, muttering to herself what else she could come up with to improve their tavern. Joe looked at her with a tender smile. He gently stroked her hair and said that her ideas were truly amazing. With a slightly awkward grin, he added that her help in the tavern was a great help to them, but running around all day as a child must be tiring. She could always take a break if she wanted to. Millie froze for a second in surprise. She asked herself, is this what parental care is like? Then a broad smile lit up her face. She replied that she was fine and that she would also do her best as a true helper. To be convincing, she gave a thumbs up, thinking that she had only just begun to repay the Spark couple for their kindness. Joe asked what this strange gesture meant, but his question went unanswered. Some time passed. Millie, who was delivering orders, thought that although it had been busy, the flow of visitors in recent days had finally slowed down a bit and returned to normal. At that moment, the doorbell rang, and two men entered the tavern. The first was quite pleasant-looking, with an open face. The second was wrapped in a cloak with a deep hood that hid his features. The main character immediately approached them and greeted them politely. She asked if they had come just to eat. The first man replied that they had not, and that they would like to rent a room. Millie nodded and pointed to the reception desk. The young man continued, saying that he was glad to finally visit the tavern that everyone had been talking about lately. Meanwhile, his companion looked around the room gloomily, barely turning his head. Then the girl remembered that since they were renting a room, she needed to know their names. The first guest introduced himself as Zach. Then he complimented Millie, saying that although she was small, she was very composed. The main character politely introduced herself in response. Zach smiled kindly, muttering that she was very cute, and then Millie asked his companion's name. The man in the cloak slowly turned his head toward her. Zach immediately apologized, awkwardly hugging his companion around the neck and saying that his real name was Will and that he was a new member of his squad. He had recently joined and was a loner. Will stood patiently nearby, his whole demeanor expressing silent discontent. Without letting go of him, Zach dragged the guy to the stairs, waving goodbye and saying that they were very tired from the road and would rest in their room until dinner. Millie muttered to herself with an awkward smile that he was very active, and Marissa, who had been watching the scene, thanked her daughter for her help. In the evening, Zach and Will came down for dinner. Zach, his eyes burning with excitement, devoured one serving after another, constantly marveling at how delicious everything was and how he had never tasted anything like it before. Will sat silently nearby, barely touching his food. The main character stood next to their table and replied with a smile that she was very happy to hear such praise. Zach, with a piece of orc katsu stuck on his fork, froze and looked at her. He couldn't help but ask where such a little girl got such manners. It was amazing. Millie then gently took the hem of her dress and curtsied slightly, replying that these were simply the manners befitting a lady. Zach repeated her words with an awkward but kind smile, addressing his silent companion, as if expecting some kind of reaction, which, however, did not follow. The girl thought that most commoners were usually quite rude, so she wanted to strive for polite and attentive service. With a slight inner smile, she noted that this was probably how she would have acted in her past life. Let the nobles find it strange, she didn't care. When a meal was finished, Zach thanked the girl for dinner and asked how much they owed. Millie paused for a moment, doing a quick calculation, then announced that dinner with orc katsu would cost 8 small copper coins per person. Zach took 2 coins out of his pocket and said that he only had regular copper coins, asking if they could give him change. Holding a small bag of change in her hands, Millie began to count in her head. 1 copper coin is equal to 10 small copper coins. After a short pause, she confidently announced that their change would be 4 small copper coins. The men exchanged brief, surprised glances. Will tried to hide his amazement by taking a sip from his cup. Then they briefly thanked them for the meal and went up to their room. At the door, Zach exhaled heavily and remarked that although the food was unusual, it turned out to be delicious. Will just nodded in response. Ignoring this, Zach continued that, for a tavern where a night costs 3 copper coins, it was incredibly clean. Will just nodded briefly, looking intently at his talkative companion. His companion continued in the same good-natured manner, saying that the girl Millie they had seen was indeed very clever. He was interrupted by the dark-haired Will, who asked if he didn't find it all strange. Zach blinked in confusion and asked what he meant. Unable to resist, Will leaned over the guy and explained irritably that he was talking about the girl. There were too many inconsistencies about her. She looked only 5 years old, but where did she get such manners, and how could she count so quickly and accurately? And in such an establishment for ordinary people, no less. Swallowing hard, Zach tried to calm him down. He said that she might be unusually smart, but calling her strange or talking about such a commonplace was just rude. Besides, Millie was very nice. Exhaling heavily, Will said that Zach probably had a very easy life with such optimism. As soon as they entered their room, Will turned on a small table lamp and sat down at the table. Zach, taking off his traveling clothes, asked if he was going to write another report. Then he added that getting promoted wasn't easy. And receiving orders like disguise yourself as an adventurer and gather information in the city was clearly not the easiest thing to do. Zack lay down on the bed and announced that he was going to sleep, advising Will to do the same. Will just asked him to be quiet, picked up a pen, and unfolded a sheet of paper. Report. About the situation in the city. Nothing particularly noteworthy has been found. Currently staying at the inn that is the subject of rumors. No notable incidents. However, just in case, I am reporting one observation. There is an unusual child in the establishment. Her behavior, manner of speech, and counting skills do not correspond to either her surroundings or her stated age. Her name is Miriana. Her nickname is Millie. Sometime later, on the other side of town, in a luxurious mansion, the butler walked down a quiet corridor, carefully pushing a table with tea and exquisite sweets in front of him. He knocked on the massive oak doors with his knuckles, apologized for the intrusion, and announced that he had brought tea. After receiving permission, he entered and stood still at the threshold in front of his master. The latter was just finishing reading a report received from one of his agents. His gaze slid over the last lines about an unusual girl from a common tavern. With a light, interested grunt, the young, handsome man with light hair said her name aloud, then said that he was curious about this unusual child. On the table in front of the main character were many of her favorite dishes. Looking at all this abundance with delight, she thought to herself that in order to satisfy her little whim, or rather, for the sake of the prosperity of the Shady Cat Inn, she had asked her adoptive father to prepare all this. Lately, she had even begun to get used to life in this world, and this thought evoked a wave of warm emotions in her. And finally, the day had come, Millie's birthday, when she turned 5 years old. Her parents congratulated their daughter with sincere joy, and she responded with the widest and happiest smile, thanking them for everything. Then Marissa handed her a hair ribbon, announcing that it was her gift. The main character was very happy and accepted the decoration with delight. She immediately asked to have it tied around her head like a headband, and her mother fulfilled her request with a tender smile. Millie thought to herself that her real date of birth in this world was unknown. Here, it was customary to celebrate birthdays not individually, but as general seasonal holidays. She was picked up in the winter when she was about 5 months old, so they decided to consider the middle of summer her official birthday. Happily touching the new decoration on her head, the girl began to hum something quietly. Marissa looked at her and said with a smile that the ribbon suited her very well. Then Millie looked around the festive table with delight and suggested that they start eating quickly before everything got cold. Wishing everyone bon appetit. The parents exchanged warm glances and looked at their daughter with affection. Joe paused for a moment, decided that now was the right moment, and began to speak while Millie was eating. The girl froze with her fork halfway to her mouth, but then continued eating, listening attentively. He cleared his throat slightly, feeling a little embarrassed. He announced that Millie would become a big sister at the beginning of next year. The main character's eyes widened in surprise, and she froze for a moment with her mouth full. Seeing her reaction, Marissa covered her mouth with her hand, trying to hide her joyful smile, while Joe hugged her shoulders, rubbing his cheeks slightly in embarrassment. Millie mentally asked herself if she had understood correctly. Was she really going to be a big sister? Realizing what had been said, her face lit up with a broad, beaming smile, and she immediately congratulated her parents, her eyes sparkling with happiness. Internally, however, she noted with a slight smirk that, of course, this was wonderful news, but when had they found the time? Most likely, it happened that night when she was sleeping over at her friend Nina's house. Although it was probably not very tactful to think about such things. The main thing was that her parents were happy and everything was fine with them. The adults, noticing her strange smile, exchanged glances with slight confusion. Joe asked what she was smiling about. Millie, folding her arms in front of her and keeping a sweet, innocent expression on her face, replied that she just thought today was the best birthday ever. Marissa's eyes filled with tears of emotion. Joe, pulling himself together, moved on to practical matters. He explained that because of the news, Marissa would now have to avoid heavy work, and he was already thinking about hiring additional help, although that could be discussed later. Millie exclaimed enthusiastically that she would now help them even more than before. Her father confirmed with a warm smile that she was their most beloved and irreplaceable helper. The girl decided that for the sake of her future younger brother or sister, who would soon be born, she would try twice as hard. A few days later, the bell above the door announced her return, and a child's voice joyfully announced that she was home. Walking into the kitchen, Millie poured 25 picked apples onto the table. She and Mike periodically had competitions to see who could pick more, and so far, the boy had always lost. Joe, standing next to the table, noted that she had brought in quite a lot this time too. He added thoughtfully that Gordon, Mike's father, had helped out again by looking after her. Maybe they should take them something as a thank you, but they had already treated them to apple chips recently. Suddenly, Millie exclaimed that she had a great idea. After a while, under her careful guidance, Joe baked a delicious apple pie. The girl took a piece, tasted it, and happily declared that it was very tasty. Mentally, she noted with relief that she had worried needlessly about the lack of sugar. The natural sweetness of the apples turned out to be just enough. Joe also took a piece, and after taking a bite, moaned with pleasure, saying that the pie was excellent and simply delicious. The main character looked at her father with a sly smile. She thought that he had really become a much better cook, and that meant it was time to start experimenting with other types of sweets. Then Joe asked if Millie could take the pie to Mike's house tomorrow. The girl immediately agreed happily. The next day at Mike's house, the boy saw the treat in Millie's hands, swallowed admiringly, and asked what this incredibly appetizing-looking thing was. The main character explained that it was called apple pie and asked him to say hello to his father. Mike readily agreed, but then frowned and declared belligerently that next time he would definitely pick more apples than her. Millie laughed awkwardly and hastily agreed. Taking the treat from the girl's hands, Mike waved goodbye, explaining that customers would be arriving soon and he needed to watch the shop. Millie smiled and said she was leaving. She was about to walk out. Suddenly, the door swung open right in front of her. The blow hit her right in the forehead. The girl let out a quiet cry of surprise and pain and fell to the floor. The man who opened the door immediately reached out to help her up and asked if she was all right. The main character, still a little dazed, nodded, and placing her small hand in his, she allowed him to lift her up. Then he asked if she was from tavern. Millie looked up at him and recognized the unsociable guest who had recently stayed with them, Mr. Will. She wondered to herself, had he forgotten? Where is he? This was a sewing shop after all. Will repeated his question aloud, asking why the girl was here. The main character explained that yesterday she and Mike had gone apple picking, and now she had brought the pie they had baked with her father. Will asked if they had gone into the forest alone. It was dangerous. The girl immediately clarified that adults had been with them, so he needn't worry. Then the man asked another question. Couldn't they just buy apples somewhere nearby? Millie's eyes widened in surprise. Her face darkened, and she rushed closer to him. She began to speak indignantly, asking if he had any idea how much an apple cost. A whole 5 small copper coins. Her allowance had only recently been increased, and now she was given only 2 coins a week. To buy just 1 apple, she would have to save for almost 3 weeks. And yesterday in the forest, she had picked 25 at once. To buy that many, she would have to save for about 63 weeks. Will took a step back, put his hand on his chest, and muttered that the only thing he understood was that she really did have very little money. At that moment, a voice came from behind the door, saying that it wasn't about money, and that Will was to blame. The next moment, a young, incredibly handsome man with a distinctly aristocratic appearance and light hair entered the room. He was wiping away tears of laughter. Then he apologized to the girl, explaining that his companion was just a weirdo. Millie looked at him with wide eyes, noting to herself that Mr. Will's friend was strikingly handsome. The man bent down slightly to be at her level and introduced himself as Leo, adding that he and Will were colleagues. The girl politely gave her name in return. She thought that if Leo was also an adventurer, then they both looked too refined for such a profession. She would never have guessed. Then Leo said that as an apology for his friend's rudeness, he would like to give her a small gift. He held out a small, neatly wrapped piece of something. Millie looked at it with great interest, then caught a painfully familiar, rich aroma. Leo explained with an animated expression that it was called chocolate. The main character snatched the sweet from his hands without even listening to the end and thanked him. Her eyes sparkling, she examined the chocolate in her palm, inwardly rejoicing at the thought that chocolate also existed in this world. It was incredibly cool. Leo watched her violent reaction in confusion. Then he slowly said that it seemed she already knew what chocolate was. But it was so rare that even in the capital, not everyone knew about it. The girl awkwardly explained, with a little trickery, that she had heard about chocolate from a merchant customer. She added that it seemed like it could be used to make various sweets. The man asked with interest what exactly she was going to make. Millie shrugged and said she would go home and think about it there. She was about to say goodbye, but Leo called out to her, asking her to wait. He admitted that he really wanted to see what kind of sweets she would make, and asked if she would mind if he went with her. The main character said shyly that she didn't mind, but, however, a short time later, all 3 of them were standing in the tavern kitchen. Joe, who was also interested, joined them. Millie stood in front of them like a head chef, cleared her throat solemnly, and announced that she would try to make scones using the chocolate Mr. Leo had given her. All 3 men looked at her in complete bewilderment, not understanding what she was talking about. Seeing their confusion, she firmly stated that in any case, they needed to start with enthusiasm. She raised her fist, and the men, a little embarrassed, repeated her gesture. To begin with, she continued, everyone needed to wash their hands thoroughly, mentally noting that it was better not to use magic on people. They just shrugged and did as she asked. Then Millie announced that it was time to start making Millie's special scones. The first thing to do was to chop the chocolate into small pieces, which Mr. Leo did under the watchful eye of the others. Then the necessary ingredients had to be mixed and the dough rolled out, which was entrusted to Mr. Will. The others watched his focused but awkward movements with smiles. Millie thought to herself with a slight regret that if they had real butter or sugar, everything would have turned out much tastier. But such ingredients were still beyond their means. All that remained was to slowly bake the dough in a preheated oven under Joe's supervision. And the chocolate scones were ready. Millie noted with nostalgia that in her past life, she had often made such a simple snack. Leo looked at the result of their joint efforts with interest and admitted that he had never seen anything like it before. Will nodded silently in agreement. Millie decided to be the first to try one. Taking a bite, she literally melted with delight at the familiar taste of chocolate, which she had missed for so long. Joe ate his scones silently, but with obvious pleasure. Leo muttered that it turned out pretty well, and Will dryly remarked that they resembled some of the pastries served in the capital. Leo then added that he never imagined chocolate could be used to make something so delicious. There was only one scone left. Millie immediately muttered that no one dared touch it. Leo, with a smirk, remarked that since it was the last one, it was still worth fighting for. Joe tried to smooth over the budding argument by reminding them that it was rude to behave that way toward guests. After a while, Leo sighed heavily and admitted that it was very tasty. But he hadn't expected the scones to be so filling. Will looked disapprovingly at his companion, mentally noting his childish behavior. Meanwhile, Joe reassured the clearly upset Millie, gently telling her that she had eaten enough. Leo noted that, apparently, many unusual dishes had appeared on their menu and asked if they were going to patent these recipes. The girl turned to him in confusion. Will explained that a patent gives you ownership of an idea, and other people can only use the recipe legally for a fee. Given the uniqueness of these dishes, the simplest one could cost about 5 copper coins, and some could even cost a small gold coin. And even if the recipe was stolen, the patent owner would have a legal right to compensation. Millie remarked with interest that it was an interesting system. Joe froze, thinking about what he had heard. Suddenly, Will announced that it was time for them to go. Leo nodded in agreement. He added that today had been a lot of fun and said goodbye, promising that they would see each other again. A little later, on the street on their way home, Leo asked his companion if Millie was really the girl from the report. Will nodded in confirmation. Leo then noted that she did seem strangely mature. Her manner of speech and ability to come up with complex recipes were not at all like those of a normal child. He was interested in her possible magical potential. Will replied that she had apparently not yet been tested for magical power, although at her age she should have been. Leo expressed his desire for someone to check this. Will sighed heavily. He regretted mentioning the girl in the report, but allowed he only promised to inform Prince Leonardo as soon as he found out anything new. Meanwhile, at the Millie Tavern, helping to clear the table, she asked her father if he knew about the recipe patenting system. Joe awkwardly admitted that yes, he did. The girl was indignant, asking why he hadn't said anything before, since it was a huge missed opportunity. Joe explained with slight irritation that both hiring and patenting required contacting the trade guild, and they had certain difficulties with that. The main character froze, asking what the matter was. Her father sighed heavily and explained that Marissa's grandfather was the head of the guild, but they had had a serious falling out in the past, and now they don't talk to each other. On the other side of town, in the merchant guild building, an employee was finishing the monthly report on new patents. The guild master dryly approved the work done. Then the clerk cautiously added that there had been rumors around town lately about a tavern called the Shady Cat Inn, where the food had become unusually delicious. Although business there had been very poor before. At that moment, there was a sharp sound. The old count had broken a quill in his hand. The frightened servant hurried to retreat, declaring the report finished. Left alone, the guild master sat in deathly silence, his face contorted with cold rage. His thoughts were clear and merciless. He would never forgive whoever dared to steal his granddaughter. Millie asked confusedly, what does bad relations mean? And why did they have such a big fight with Grandpa, the head of the guild? Joe looked seriously at his daughter. Then he turned away and said briefly that there were many reasons behind it. In a gloomy tone, he added that he had no intention of contacting the trade guild, neither for hiring nor for licensing. The main character, upset, tried to find out more, but Joe abruptly cut off the conversation, saying that the subject was closed. Millie frowned as she watched her father walk away. After a while, The girl calmly swept the area at the entrance to the tavern. An unfamiliar man approached the door, and she informed him with a polite smile that the establishment was not yet open. The man yanked the door open and, without looking at her, said that he wasn't a customer, but had come to see the owner on business. Millie called after him, but he ignored her and headed straight for the bar. Joe was standing with his back to the entrance, and without turning around, politely asked him to wait until opening time. However, the stranger dismissively remarked that it was very noisy in the establishment at the moment. The girl's father turned around and looked questioningly at the guest. The man folded his arms across his chest and introduced himself as the owner of the neighboring Manpukudai Tavern. Both men sat down at table. Millie brought the guest a drink, mentally noting that this was the owner. She looked at him disapprovingly. He didn't even say thank you. The girl felt that she frankly disliked this man. Meanwhile, the guest announced that he had come with a request. Joe, unobtrusively shielding his daughter, asked what exactly he wanted. The guest, without taking his eyes off his mug, said the new dish had recently appeared on the menu at the Shady Cat Inn, or Katsu, if he remembered correctly. Then he leaned back in his chair, put his hand under his head, and asked with smug nonchalance if they would give him the recipe. Joe's eyes widened, and he stared at the guest. Clutching the fabric of his trousers, he muttered that it was impossible to give away the recipe. On noticing his reaction, the guest turned away and, looking around the room, noticed that their tavern was finally thriving. And come to think of it, could it have something to do with that new dish? He waved his hand casually in Joe's direction. Millie grimaced in displeasure, inwardly indignant. However, Joe frowned and stated clearly that he could not give away the recipe for their most popular dish. The guest waved his hand dismissively, telling him not to be dramatic. After all, he was not asking for it for free. He offered a whole 3 copper coins. Millie stared at him angrily, remembering how much time, effort, and trial and error they had spent perfecting this recipe. This strange man had just appeared out of nowhere and demanded the recipe for a super popular dish that they had put their hearts and souls into, and for only 3 copper coins. Mentally converting the amount into familiar yen, she thought indignantly that it was only 3,000. She remembered Mr. Will's words that even the simplest recipe could cost at least 5 copper coins. How dare he? The main character clenched her fists and lowered her head, trying to hide her raging emotions. She was about to speak up, but Joe beat her to it. He rose abruptly from the table and, looking the guest straight in the eye, declared with all seriousness that he was not going to sell such a valuable recipe for a pittance. This recipe was like a treasure to him. Millie looked at her father with admiration, her eyes wide and filled with tears of pride and tenderness. The guest exclaimed in bewilderment, his face contorted with anger, and he slammed his fist on the table. Joe pushed back his chair and said firmly that if that was all, it was time for the guest to leave. Visitors would be arriving soon, and they needed to prepare. The main character thought proudly that her father had handled the situation perfectly. The owner of Manpukudai wanted to continue the argument, but the tavern door swung open and the first visitors appeared on the threshold. They greeted him and asked if they could come in. The man looked at them angrily and sighed discontentedly. He pushed them out of the way and went outside. The guy who had been pushed, rubbing his bruised shoulder, asked who it was. Joe immediately rushed over to apologize to them with an awkward smile and said that everything would be ready soon, offering them any available seats. And soon, as usual, the tavern was filled with people. Weaving between tables, Millie thought that in this world, recipes were truly worth their weight in gold. Once, she asked Marissa to take her to the market. In fact, the ingredients and seasonings were familiar to her from her past life. Although instead of the usual meat, monster meat was used here, but she was already used to that. Nevertheless, the food culture in this world was underdeveloped, and recipes meant even more to establishments than to ordinary people. That is why there was a whole system of patenting. Looking at the plate of orkatsu in her hands, the main character thought that they simply had to protect this recipe. Later that evening, when there were no more customers, Millie gathered her parents and, standing before them in a determined pose, announced that she was calling an emergency family meeting. The adults looked at her in bewilderment but agreed to listen. The girl began by saying that the agenda item was patenting recipes. She believed that it would be best to go to the trade guild and officially register them. Joe just sighed heavily and remained silent. Millie continued by asking if she understood correctly that after patenting a recipe, the purchase fee would only be charged once. Her father crossed his arms and explained that this was not quite the case. If you buy a recipe for personal use, yes, you pay once. But if you use it in business, you have to pay an annual fee. The main character thought that this meant the man wanted to get away with paying only 3 copper coins, avoiding the annual payments. Angered even more, she decided in her mind that she would never forgive him for this. And it dawned on her. What if someone copied the recipe from the Shady Cat Inn and patented it first? Then they would have to pay to use their own invention. She turned specifically to her father, saying that she completely agreed with him. The Orkatsu recipe was their treasure. She firmly stated that the recipe, into which she and her father had put so much effort and soul, could not be allowed to be stolen. Millie looked seriously at her parents, waiting for their reaction. Joe sighed heavily and repeated that yes, the recipe Millie had created was their real treasure. He got up from the table and said with firm determination that it seemed they would have to gather their courage and take action after all. Marissa looked at her husband with tenderness and support. Millie literally beamed at these words. Turning to his wife, Joe said that her grandfather had once ordered him to stay away, but now it seemed they had no choice. Marissa silently confirmed his words with a slight smile. Then the main character decided to ask again why they severed ties with her grandfather so completely. Joe poured water into a mug. He began to explain that they had fallen out with all their relatives even before they bought this inn. So they ended up cut off from Marissa's entire family, including her grandfather, the former head of the trading house. At these words, both Marissa and her husband lowered their eyes, their postures expressing sadness. His daughter, not letting up, pressed him with questions. Joe paused for a second. Then Marissa quietly took his hand. She said that Millie deserved to know the whole truth. Joe nodded in agreement and admitted that he knew this conversation would inevitably happen someday. Then he looked up at Millie and said the most important thing, that she was his daughter and he loved her with all his heart. But they're not her biological parents. The main character froze. Joe, folding his hands on the table, continued. He said that they did indeed have a biological daughter named Lisa, but she died when she was only a few months old. To hide their grief from others, they often visited her grave at night. It was there, in the cemetery, that they found an abandoned girl, whom they later named Millie. For Marissa's parents, this was the last straw. They refused to accept a child who was not their own into the family, and Marissa and Joe could not come to terms with this. Millie silently digested what she had heard. She knew she wasn't their biological daughter, and she knew about Lisa, but she couldn't even imagine that her adoptive parents would sever all ties with their family for her sake. Then Marissa spoke up. Folding her arms across her chest, Marissa said with deep feeling that this was precisely why they didn't want to get involved with the trade guild. She didn't want her biological family to say anything bad or hurt Millie. The girl looked at her parents in amazement. She thought that since her grandfather was against her being accepted into the family, he was unlikely to treat her kindly. Perhaps that was why they were so restricted. They couldn't hire people or take on many jobs without the guild's permission. Then she looked at her parents. Their faces were full of excitement and concern for her. Millie apologized to them in her mind for causing them so much worry. The family she was born into in this world was terrible, and she never considered those people her parents. She had known from the beginning that they had taken her in. Then Millie smiled broadly and sincerely and thanked the adults for telling her everything. Marissa and Joe may not be her biological parents, but they are her real family, and she loved them very much. The adults couldn't hold back their emotions at these words. Tears welled up in their eyes. Millie didn't notice their reaction right away and wanted to continue, but in the next moment, both parents jumped up from their seats and called out her name. Hugging her from both sides, they burst into tears, repeating how much they loved her. Standing in this strong, warm embrace, Millie felt safe and completely at peace. After a while, the adults calmed down a little and stepped back, wiping away their tears. Marissa thanked the girl for accepting this difficult truth so calmly. Her daughter nodded affirmatively, and then she stated firmly, it was decided they would go and patent the recipe. She asked her parents not to pay attention to her grandfather's possible barbs. She promised that she wouldn't either. Joe, suddenly caught up in her enthusiasm, agreed that they should start as soon as possible. After all, Marissa was about to give birth and couldn't overexert herself. The seriousness of the moment was unexpectedly broken by Marissa herself, who couldn't hold back a slight chuckle. Joe, looking at his daughter, said with surprise that she looked very serious and grown up. Was she really only 5 years old? Millie laughed briefly in response, thinking to herself that she would definitely protect their family and their shared recipes. After a while, Millie and her father arrived at the Trade Guild building. They sat in the waiting room, waiting to be called. The girl pressed herself against her father, expressing silent support with her whole being. Then she looked up at him and asked quietly if he was all right. Joe, without looking at her and staring into the void on the wall, replied briefly that he was. Recalling previous events at the family council, it was finally decided to patent the recipes and hire employees through the guild. And so today, they came here early in the morning. The girl mentally noted that it was good she had come with him, She had never seen Joe so tense and distant before. She decided to ask one more question, asking if Marissa's grandfather was really such a terrible person. Joe looked at her in surprise. Then he looked back at the wall and said that he didn't particularly like him, although the reason was clear to him in general terms. Millie watched anxiously as her father clenched his hands tightly on his knees, trying to control himself. She wondered what kind of person her grandfather was and whether he would publicly humiliate them. Suddenly, a loud voice behind them announced that visitors with number 3 could proceed to the reception room. Millie immediately cheered up, raised her fists, and snapped her father out of his stupor, telling him that they were being called and to hold on. The two of them entered the spacious office and sat down at a large table. For several minutes, the room was silent. Then one of the guild employees entered the office in uniform, with light, slicked-back hair. He was holding a folder with papers in his hands. He apologized dryly for being late, sat down opposite them, and explained that in order to patent the recipe, they first needed to fill out a number of documents. He handed Joe several sheets of paper. With a hint of contempt in his voice, he asked if Joe needed help filling them out. Joe, ignoring the tone, replied that everything was fine and he could manage. The guild employee narrowed his eyes slightly and remarked that this was rare for commoners. Ordinary people, unless they are merchants or from wealthy families, often cannot even read or write. Joe, like Marissa, had received a good education in this regard. Then Millie, interrupting her thoughts, looked at the clerk. She thought he seemed unpleasant. Her intuition had not failed her last time. As soon as the papers were filled out, the guild employee took them and scanned the text. He muttered that this was the first time he had heard of the Shady Cat Inn. He casually remarked that it was probably an establishment for commoners, which was unlikely to be very profitable. Then he left the room, telling them to wait a moment while he brought the prescription form and contract. Millie watched him go with disapproval. She had a bad feeling about this. Quite a bit of time passed, and the main character, with growing irritation, thought that they were being made to wait too long. Finally, the same employee returned to the room. With a fake smile, he apologized for the delay. He sat down at the table and asked her to sign the contract, then to provide the prescription, passing the papers to Joe. He began to carefully study the documents, getting a little lost in the text and clearly straining. Millie tried to look, but could hardly make anything out. Looking at her father, she wondered if he even understood what was written there. Should she check everything, just in case? She was very disturbed by the smug expression on the employee's face. Making up her mind, she jumped onto her father's lap, wrapping her arms around his neck. He instinctively picked her up with one arm and asked in surprise what was wrong. With a completely innocent look on her face, the main character looked at him and said that she just wanted to look at the contract with him, sitting next to him. Joe sighed heavily, sat her down comfortably, closed his eyes for a moment, and agreed that they would look at it together. Ignoring his gentle strokes on her head, Millie began to read the text carefully. The first lines looked standard, but at the very bottom, in very small print, there was a note. The guild employee hastily said that the content of the contract should not cause them any problems and that, since there were many visitors in the morning, it would be good to finish as soon as possible. Joe nodded in agreement, picked up a pen, and was about to sign. Suddenly, his daughter exclaimed, asking him to wait. She grabbed his hand, holding it back, and said that something was strange here. The clerk intervened. He told her not to interfere with her father. He suggested calling someone from behind the counter to look after her. Ignoring him, Millie picked up the contract and pointed out one clause to her father, asking him to look more closely. It stated that all recipes patented in the future would also automatically fall under the terms of this agreement on a semi-permanent basis. After reading it carefully, Joe asked indignantly what that meant. After all, this meant that the trade guild would take the lion's share of their future profits. Then he looked up at the man opposite him and repeated the question. The man began to get nervous, laughed awkwardly, and said that this was standard practice in the trade guild. In addition, the main agreement would appear later. After this one was signed, the recipe would be checked, and if there were no problems with the main contract, the deal would go ahead. Millie frowned, watching him closely. She thought he was clearly lying. His eyes were darting around. Could this man really be? The main character asked aloud, is their entire trade guild nothing more than a bunch of crooks? The employee froze in shock, tried to say something in response, then fell silent. He exclaimed how she dared to talk such nonsense. Millie shouted back that it all sounded very much like the truth. Weren't these documents that would replace the main contract? The guild would insist that the main contract would appear later, but since they had already signed this paper, it must be real. Then it dawned on her, and she asked if they were going to blackmail the Shady Cat Inn later, demanding recipes and technology. With each word she spoke, the employee's face grew paler and more frightened. Millie got up from her father's lap, leaned her hands on the table, and continued, Is it normal for such a share of the profits to go to the guild? Maybe this man came up with this contract himself, and all the money would go straight into his pocket? The guild employee frowned, leaning his head tensely over the table. Then he suddenly jumped up from his seat, shouting that she was a little brat. He grabbed her by the hair, saying that children had become completely unruly lately. Millie's eyes filled with tears from the pain, and she tried to pull the strand of hair from his hand. Joe immediately jumped up, shouting his daughter's name. He punched the worker hard in the face, growling that he shouldn't dare touch his girl, and held the child close to him, lifting her up and stroking her soothingly. The man flew back against the wall from the blow and hit his head, but not hard. Touching his cheek, he muttered that it hurt. Then he smiled. He declared that since Joe had raised his hand to a guild employee, he was finished. Then he loudly called for security, ordering them to grab him. 2 guards immediately burst into the room. Pushing the girl out her father's arms, they grabbed Joe, threw him to the floor, and pinned him down, ordering him to behave himself. Then the guild worker pointed at Millie and ordered them to grab her too, and not to touch the documents on the table, because now they were evidence. The girl became even more serious, realizing that the man wanted to destroy the evidence. She would never given those papers. Summoning all her willpower, she mentally called upon the magic of the wind. The documents on the table rose smoothly into the air and floated gently toward her. One of the guards noticed the strange movement of the documents in the air. Seeing the girl quickly hide them behind her back, he rudely asked what she was doing and ordered her to hand over the papers immediately. A guild employee shouted, demanding that the guards deal with the girl quickly. The first guard rushed to carry out the order. At that moment, Joe, still pinned to the floor, began to struggle violently, shouting that they should not dare touch his daughter. The second guard snapped at him to shut up, took out his baton, and swung it hard at the man's head. Joe slumped heavily to the floor, unconscious. Millie broke free from the first guard's grip and rushed to her father. She cupped his face in her hands, begging him to hold on, and wanted to do something. But when she removed her hands, she saw blood on them. A dark, growing pool was already forming under her father's head. The main character turned pale with horror, unable to take her eyes off the scene. Then the guild worker spoke again. He combed his hair back and said with cold arrogance that this is what happens to those who start to riot. Then he ordered the girl's documents to be taken away again. Millie slowly got up from her knees. Her gaze became empty and distant as she stared out the window. Suddenly, everything in the room began to shake. The floor and walls shook, and a slight humming sound could be heard. The guards froze in confusion. The guild employee panicked and began to rush them. Joe, regaining consciousness for a moment, weakly called his daughter's name, trying to stop her, but his strength left him, and his head fell back to the floor. The main character froze in tension. Then she slowly turned to face them. Her hands were clenched into white fists, and her hair began to rise as if from an invisible wind. Her voice, low and filled with icy fury, rang out in the ensuing silence, asking what they had done to her father. Suddenly, the whole room shook even harder. The floor and walls shook with renewed force, causing the windows to rattle. Deep cracks began to appear in the ceiling and walls, and the sound of breaking wood and plaster could be heard. The men in the room began to suffocate, as if the air had become thick and heavy. One of the guards muttered with difficulty that his legs were not responding. The guild worker, deathly pale, leaned against the table, muttering that he was losing consciousness. Millie stood motionless, her gaze filled with cold, ruthless fury directed at her weakening opponents. At that moment, Joe came to his senses. His thoughts were muddled, but his instincts told him that his daughter was in danger. With great effort, he raised his head and saw her standing in the epicenter of the chaos. He called her name in a barely audible, garbled voice and tried to crawl toward her. Hearing her father's faint voice, Millie seemed to wake up from a deep sleep. Her eyes widened as she realized what was happening. The tension in the air immediately disappeared, and her hair fell to her shoulders. She looked around in horror. The window frame was broken. The inkwell had been knocked over, flooding the table, and the entire room was covered in a web of cracks. The guards and the clerk lay unconscious. She stood alone on a small, untouched island of floor. The documents she had so fiercely protected lay gently beside her. A terrible thought pierced her. Could she have done all this? Apparently, her rage had unleashed her magic, and it had burst out, trying to protect her. Then she heard a quiet moan again. Millie snapped out of her stupor and rushed to her father, kneeling beside him. In a panic, she asked if he was okay. Joe, overcoming the pain, tried to reassure her, saying that everything was fine. Millie pressed her lips together to hold back her tears as she looked at his terrible wound. She gently hugged him around the neck, trying not to cause him any more pain. At that moment, the door to the room burst open. Several people appeared in the doorway. The main character looked at them anxiously. Enrique Rosetta, former chairman of the Rosetta Trading Company and current head of the Eastern District Trade Guild, stepped forward. Enrique looked around the destroyed room with concern and asked in confusion what the noise was. His gaze slid over the shapeless bodies of the guild workers sprawled on the floor, and he stammered, asking why they were all lying there. And what had happened here? Then he looked more closely at the people in the room. His attention was drawn to the familiar silhouette of a man with a girl clinging to him. Enrique said incredulously, "Is that Joe Spark lying there?" Millie looked up at him. A thought struck her like lightning. If this man knew her father's name, then he must be the head of the trade guild who had brought him to this state. The girl's face darkened with determined severity. She bluntly told the stunned man that he was probably the one behind all this fraud. Enrique asked her confusedly what she meant. Millie replied that she and Joe had come here only to patent the recipes, but had encountered deception. She asked him angrily if he was the leader of this gang. Clearly not understanding anything, Mr. Rosetta frowned and asked again for clarification. In response, Millie shouted that they were all crooks and that when she pointed out problems in the contract, they simply attacked her and her father. Enrique stepped forward sharply and exclaimed that this was nonsense and asked if she had any evidence. The main character nodded firmly and said she did. She picked up the sheet of paper lying on the floor, which she had been so desperately defending, and showed it to the guild leader, saying that it was the very contract that the employee had given them. She added that the man could look at it, but since it was important evidence, he must not touch it. Mr. Rosetta approached the girl and leaned over, thoughtfully reading the contract and rubbing his beard. Reaching the end of the text, he found a clause that had previously confused Millie and caused the whole unpleasant situation. His eyes widened in shock. Then he straightened up, clenched his hands tightly into fists in anger, cleared his throat, and said that he understood everything. He added that he would like to hear the details, but first it would be worth treating Joe's wounds. Enrique reached out to the wounded man, but the girl noticed the movement. She looked displeased and concerned. Then she jumped up and stood between them, spreading her arms wide. She cried out that they should not dare touch her father. Millie frowned, and tears still stood in her eyes from fear for her father. The man straightened up, took a step back, and then said discontentedly that she was his granddaughter's adopted daughter. Mr. Rosetta sighed heavily, turned around, and asked Millie to calm down. He said he would order people he could trust to take Joe to the infirmary and treat him. Then he reached out his hand to the girl and asked her to come with him. He asked if she wanted to stay in this ruined room. Sometime later, in the guild master's office, Millie sat on the sofa and told her great-great-grandfather what had happened. He sat opposite her in an armchair and listened attentively. The main character folded her hands in front of her on her knees and asked if the guild would punish the people who tried to deceive her and her father. Enrique frowned and sighed heavily. He asked her name and, after waiting for her to nod, said that she was right. Mr. Rosetta noted that with such a contract, those people could indeed be called fraudsters, and there would be no argument. He added that it seemed that the employee who had received them had secretly forged the contract without the guild's knowledge, and that he had already ordered a check of all the other documents that employee had handled. Then, expressing sincere regret that the guild employee had used violence against Joe Spark, he bowed his head. Millie remained silent, frozen in surprise. She thought that, as the head of the guild who had overlooked his subordinates' machinations, Enrique was certainly obliged to apologize. But he didn't just formally acknowledge the mistake, he sincerely apologized for his subordinates' actions and quickly arranged for Joe to receive treatment, even though he was known to dislike him. The girl mentally noted that her grandfather seemed to be a good person in his own right. The main character tensed up internally, realizing that she needed to calm down. She had lost her temper a little earlier, so now she had to speak normally. Enrique straightened up and said he wanted to make it up to her and Joe somehow. Millie waved her hand dismissively, replying that no apology was necessary, and then asked a little awkwardly if they could quietly deal with the trashed room. The man tilted his head slightly and asked what had happened to the room. The main character muttered embarrassedly that her magic had apparently gotten out of control. She explained that when she saw her father injured, she lost control of herself. Then Millie bowed her head and offered her sincere apologies. She continued that the deception had, of course, come as a shock to her, but she herself had unwittingly destroyed the room. The girl looked thoughtfully at her hands. Then she raised her head, smiled warmly, and asked if they could consider it mutual damage. Mr. Rosetta looked at her in surprise and muttered that such an outcome would certainly be helpful to the guild. But then he asked much more seriously if the child's magic had really gotten out of control. And how strong was it anyway? The main character smiled friendly and conspiratorially in response, put her index finger to her mouth, and said it was a secret. The old man just looked at her in surprise. Enrique sighed heavily again, then nodded and said he would ask his trusted people to restore the room to its previous state. Millie froze for a few seconds, feeling downcast. Recalling the previous events, she thought about how anyone would have thought that anger would unleash her magic like that, and that now she should be much more careful. Then the main character raised her head toward the guild leader who had risen from the table and, stammering, asked what would happen to the people she had stunned. Mr. Rosetta casually remarked that they would soon come to. Millie beamed at this news. The man continued, adding that it would be fair to say that those people were to blame for everything. He also said that he would not tell anyone about her magic. The girl nodded happily in agreement and thanked him. Then the man said that they would also keep the whole issue of fraud within the guild a secret. Millie intervened and remarked with a smile that it all sounded very much like a deal. Enrique turned to the girl and asked indignantly if she was really a normal child. He folded his arms across his chest in displeasure and said that she had spoken in a mature tone from the very beginning. Suddenly, there was a knock at the office door. A handsome young man, one of the guild's employees, peeked into the room. He smiled apologetically for interrupting the conversation and announced that Marissa Spark had arrived. He explained that she had come for her daughter, as she had been gone too long. Then Marissa herself entered the room. She folded her hands neatly in front of her, then smiled sweetly at Enrique, saying that they hadn't seen each other in a long time, called him grandfather, and asked how he was doing. The man looked at the guest and literally lit up for a second, exclaiming her name. Millie watched the scene unfold in bewilderment. Enrique immediately rushed to the girl, excitedly asking if she was all right. After all, long trips can be difficult in her condition. The man asked in amazement if she had walked here. Marissa laughed and replied that she had come by hitchhiking. The man began to worry even more, saying that it must have been crowded and uncomfortable. So why did she take such a risk? What if something had happened to her? Millie watched the scene in amazement and thought that if Enrique had a tail, it would surely be wagging happily from side to side. Then she wondered, did he really love Marissa after all? The man continued to insist that he would arrange a separate carriage for the return trip, to which Marissa gratefully agreed. Millie remembered how the family council had discussed her grandfather, and everyone thought he was cursing their family with the worst words. But now it was clear that the reason he disliked Joe so much was because he was the husband of his beloved granddaughter. Then she wondered if maybe he was just a tsundere grandfather who adored his granddaughter. But the sudden thought that he might be watching her sent a chill down her spine. After all, how did he find out about her pregnancy? After a while, the three of them sat down for a cup of tea. Marissa hugging Millie around the shoulders, and Enrique beaming with happiness across from them. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. The guild leader allowed the visitor to enter. Joe entered the room with his head bandaged. Seeing him, Marissa and her daughter rushed to him. They asked anxiously if he was all right. He rubbed his head awkwardly and said that everything was fine now. The girl said she was very worried about him. Enrique stood up. He bowed his head and apologized to Joe for what had happened, adding that as the head of the trade guild, he offered his deepest regrets. Joe turned to him, hugged his wife around the shoulders, ruffled his daughter's hair, and said that of course he was very angry, but fortunately Millie was unharmed. He then thanked him for the treatment. Mr. Rosetta continued that he would like to apologize properly later, and if possible, when everything had settled down, they could come and patent the recipes as they had wanted. He added that he was sincerely sorry. Millie thought that it seemed their main goal, patenting recipes, would be achieved. She realized that her tsundere grandfather, who had been the cause of her fears, wasn't so scary after all, and it wouldn't hurt for the Shady Cat Inn to build a good relationship with the trade guild. A little later, they were all standing on the street, getting ready to leave. Marissa waved goodbye to her grandfather, and Joe helped her get into the carriage. When Millie started to follow, Enrique remembered something and asked her to wait a moment. He handed her some cookies, neatly wrapped in a handkerchief, and said that although it wasn't a full snack, he asked her to take them with her. The main character beamed and stared at the treat, thinking that for the first time in her life, she was seeing truly normal sweets. She took one cookie, took a bite, and quietly moaned with delight. It was so sweet and rich, as if no expense had been spared in making it. Simply perfect. Joe called out to her, asked her with a sly smile to come down from heaven to earth, and remarked that since it was such an expensive treat, it was worth savoring. Millie closed her eyes, thanked her grandfather, and said that now they were reconciled. The man froze in shock for a moment, mentally repeating that she had called him grandfather. Then he turned away, embarrassed, and said that they would see each other soon anyway. He asked her to be careful on her way home. A short time later, Enrique was standing in his office. He sighed heavily because his beloved granddaughter had left again. He thought about the girl Millie, about how she was the one. He had never heard of such an uncontrolled release of magic with such devastating consequences, and he wondered anxiously how much power was hidden within her. However, if his beloved Marissa was happy, then he could rest easy. After all, he wasn't against them taking in an adopted daughter. It was just that Marissa's parents were adamantly opposed, and because of that, he hadn't been able to see her for a long time. How happy he was to finally see her face after all these years. But he still couldn't stand her husband, Joe Spark. There was a slight rustle behind him, and Enrique, without turning around, asked if it was Geku who had moved. He received a quiet confirmation. He turned and looked at his subordinate in a mask and cloak. He asked if he knew that his great-granddaughter had so much magical power. Geku muttered that he did not. He had watched her as a regular visitor to the tavern, but had no idea she possessed such power. Enrique nodded, then gave orders to clean up the damaged room in the next couple of days. Geku added that there was something else. He was the one who had arranged for Marissa to come to the guild, believing that his master should finally meet his granddaughter. Master Rosetta waved it off, saying that it didn't matter because thanks to him, he had seen Marissa for the first time in a long time. Then he ordered to continue reporting on the Shady Cat Inn. He noted that Millie was a time bomb and that she should be placed under special surveillance. A few days after the incident at the trade guild, Millie and her father came back to patent the recipes. They settled down on the sofa, placing several dishes in front of them, while Enrique Rosetta sat opposite them in his chair. He explained that in order to officially approve the patents, he needed to taste everything. The main character agreed and nodded decisively, inviting him to begin. The man speared a piece of orkkatsu with his fork, took a bite, and looked at the food in surprise, muttering that it was very tasty. Such recipes would definitely sell, especially this ork cutlet, which turned out to be simply delicious. Millie gave a thumbs up and glanced at her father, mentally noting that her grandfather had highly praised their tavern's signature dish. Enrique asked with sincere surprise if the girl had really come up with all this herself. The next moment, he put down his fork, put his hands on his hips, and said that releasing so many new recipes at once could attract unwanted attention, so that envious people wouldn't figure out their restaurant. It would be better to quietly patent the recipes under a different name, creating a new trading company for this purpose. In other words, to organize a cover. Millie thought for a few seconds. Fortunately, the Shady Cat Inn was famous for its delicious food, and rumors about it were already circulating among adventurers in the Eastern District. The aristocrats didn't visit their part of town, so it was too early to worry about the recipes being stolen. However, she thought with dissatisfaction that if many people like that trickster from Mankaputii showed up, it would be a real nightmare. Joe listened carefully and added that if the Shady Cat informally bought these patents from a new company, everything would be fine. They would patent the recipes under a different name, and the issue of possible theft would be resolved. Once all the options had been considered, Joe turned to his daughter and said that since she was the creator of the recipes, she should come up with a name for the new company. The main character paused thoughtfully for a few seconds, thinking that the name should be something tasteful. Since they were deliberately disguising themselves, it had to be witty and in no way connected to the Shady Cat Inn. The next moment, it dawned on her. She said that the name of the trading company would be the Paper Dummy and asked the adults what they thought of the idea. Enrique rubbed his beard thoughtfully and asked again, clarifying what it meant. Millie froze in confusion, realizing that the explanation would be complicated. After all, it was a play on words, meaning that the Paper Dummy was a fictitious company that existed only on paper. So she just smiled and said that the name simply sounded good. Enrique said that if she liked it, then so be it. The main character thought the name was perfect, and she really liked it. That's how the temporary cover name, the Shady Cat Inn, was born. The Paper Puppet Trading Company. After a while, the three of them sat in the same places and drank tea. Suddenly, Enrique cleared his throat and asked Joe how Marissa was doing. Joe, remembering recent events, became slightly embarrassed and said that thanks to Mr. Rosetta, she was doing well. Her belly was already quite large, and the baby had even kicked recently. At these words, the older man literally lit up, imagining the scene. He noticed how sad the older man became. Millie was surprised, sighed heavily, and asked why he didn't just visit them if he missed them. Joe muttered that it wasn't worth complicating things. Enrique choked on his tea and exclaimed, "What kind of insolence is this?" Then he said more quietly that he could hear everything. The main character laughed awkwardly and apologized, saying she didn't think he would hear. It turned out that the man had excellent hearing. Joe frowned and asked his daughter not to tease her grandfather. Enrique exclaimed irritably that Joe should not dare call him grandfather. Joe, however, paid no attention to this, thinking aloud that before Marissa gave birth, he needed to find new employees and promote the tavern's business. Mr. Rosetta chuckled thoughtfully and said that they should take a look at the guild bulletin board on their way back. Millie intervened, stating firmly that since it was for her mother, her grandfather should do his best. Hearing these words, Enrique frowned sternly. He replied that for Marissa's sake, he would find the best people he could, and that they could count on him. Millie thanked him gratefully, thinking to herself that her Tsundere grandfather was surprisingly simple-minded. After a while, her grandfather accompanied Millie and her father to the exit. Joe had to stay at the reception desk for a moment, so he asked his daughter to wait for him at the entrance, promising to come soon. The main character nodded in agreement. Then Enrique approached her. He called out to her. He said that her magical power was a real bomb and asked if she had already passed the mandatory check. The girl asked in confusion what that was. Enrique clarified that Joe had told her that upon reaching the age of 5, everyone was required to undergo a magic check at the church. This test measures the amount of magic and determines the magical element that a person can use. Such tests are conducted regularly there. He added that one of these tests would be held next month, and that she would definitely be taken there, right? Millie froze thoughtfully when she heard these words. Then her grandfather advised her once again to be careful. At that moment, Joe approached and, scratching his head awkwardly, said that they could go, apologizing for the delay. Enrique nodded in agreement. Finally, he wished them a safe journey. Millie waved goodbye in response. Joe reached out his hand to his daughter and said it was time to go home. The main character grabbed his hand with a big smile. Then she froze thoughtfully. She remembered her great-grandfather's warning. He said he was worried. If her magic attracted attention, given its enormous power, it could easily be taken away from her, a commoner. And in the future, this could become a serious problem. Thinking about this, Millie decided that perhaps she really shouldn't get involved with the church, but she didn't want to part with Marissa and Joe for anything. Back home, the main character sat in her room and sighed heavily, thinking about the situation. With a wave of her hand, she summoned sparks of all the basic elements into the air. Then she smiled smugly, mentally addressing her Tsundere grandfather, implying that she was actually in control of everything. After all, she had been secretly training every day to increase her mana reserves. As a result, she was now able to create 100 small lights at once. Recently, she had even learned to form a large, stable ball of light. As she had discovered, magic in this world was divided into life magic, such as pure light, classical elemental magic, water, earth, wind, fire, as well as white and black magic. In addition, there were also rare regional elements. Millie remembered how, looking at the wounded Joe, she desperately wished she knew white healing magic. So after that incident, she began to secretly practice both white and black magic. She remembered a time when she tried to heal an injured cat with a healing spell. She also practiced black magic separately, cautiously experimenting with the darkness spell. However, this magic consumed an incredible amount of energy, which the girl learned from her own unpleasant experience. Magic was primarily an image, and perhaps it was some kind of bonus from rebirth, but all the elements obeyed her. Millie increased her mana reserves and the range of magic available to her every day, but, sighing heavily, she thought that it seemed she would have to go through this church test after all. She would hide the elements somehow, showing only one. But the main problem was the amount of mana. If things continued like this, she would definitely be exposed. The main character thought with dissatisfaction that, according to her great-grandfather, if her true power was discovered, she could be forcibly taken away or even kidnapped, which was the last thing she wanted. The mere thought of it sent shivers down her spine. Millie didn't want to part with her parents, so she had to continue developing the Shady Cat Inn. Sighing heavily once more, she made her decision. And soon the day of the test arrived. Nina and her mother came to the inn. The girl smiled happily and said she had come for Millie. Meanwhile, Marissa smiled warmly at the woman and asked her to look after her daughter. She smiled back sweetly, nodded, and asked Marissa not to worry and to relax. Meanwhile, the main character came downstairs and apologized for being late. Nina was about to say hello to her, but instead she gasped in fright. The women also turned around and were horrified when they saw the girl. She looked extremely exhausted, with deep dark circles under her eyes, as if she hadn't slept for several nights in a row. A little later, the three of them, Millie, Nina, and her mother, were sitting in a carriage on their way to the church for the test. Nina said excitedly that it was all so exciting. Their family had run an oil mill for generations, so she would most likely manifest the element of fire. Then she turned to her friend and asked what kind of magic she wanted. Millie thought for a few seconds, closing her eyes wearily, afraid to reveal that she knew much more about magic than was appropriate for her age, and then replied that she would like the water element, because it was so interesting. She laughed awkwardly, which only made Nina look at her in confusion. Millie herself was thinking about how Joe couldn't tear himself away from work at the Shady Cat Inn, because it was already lunchtime and Marissa, being pregnant, had to avoid unnecessary stress and get plenty of rest. That's why she was going to the magic test with Nina and her mother. Since early morning, her parents had been trying their best to cheer her up, wishing her luck and assuring her that she would succeed. Meanwhile, the main character had only one thing on her mind. Her true magical power must not be revealed. So her plan had to work. A violent jolt on a particularly bumpy stretch of road snapped her out of her deep thoughts. Millie turned pale and began to feel nauseous. Nina sympathetically remarked that the ride was particularly rough today. Millie didn't respond, only thinking heavily that she was so tired she didn't even have the strength to speak. Until their departure, she had been using light magic nonstop, probably summoning small balls hundreds of times. As a result, her magical power reserves must have been significantly depleted. Nina groaned that she was also starting to feel unwell. Meanwhile, they drove up to the church and stopped. The main character looked in amazement at the majestic building in front of her, thinking that this was where the test for both commoners and aristocrats would take place, and the difference in status was immediately apparent. She remarked aloud that there was still time before their turn. Then she turned to her friend and, seeing her pale face, called out to her with concern. Nina muttered that she felt sick, and then noted with surprise that Millie had barely been able to stand on her feet that morning, but now looked much more cheerful. The main character laughed awkwardly, replying that she had just slept in the carriage. She couldn't admit that she was staggering because of the deliberate depletion of her magical energy. They entered the waiting room, and Millie felt something was wrong. Her magical power seemed to be replenishing itself. She needed to use a little more magic right before the test. She got up from the bench, told her refreshed friend that she was going to quickly run off to the bathroom, and received a nod in response. Looking around in fascination, she walked somewhere and eventually realized she was lost. In one of the spacious, deserted halls, she stopped, struck by a row of majestic statues. She became curious about what these sculptures were, godlike figures, perhaps the gods of this world. And at the edge was a statue of some kind of beast man. She muttered aloud that one of the statues had something growing out of its head. A strange, calm voice continued for her, explaining that it was a horn and that she was looking at 5 divine beasts, servants of the gods. The voice also added that, judging by her expression, she probably mistook them for beastmen. Millie turned to the stranger, about to say that he seemed to know his stuff. But at these words, she froze in surprise. Standing before her was a tall young man with light, almost golden hair and noble features. His elegant but austere clothing indicated that he was a clergyman and a very high-ranking one at that. His entire appearance exuded incredible nobility. Millie remembered Joe's words about there being many blondes among the aristocracy. The girl looked back at the statues, mentally noting that the stranger did indeed have very beautiful golden hair. This man was undoubtedly an aristocrat. The man decided to satisfy her curiosity and told her that in the center was a statue of the creator goddess. To her left was the harvest goddess Krisha wearing a wreath and holding a branch, and the god of peace Bolti, the one with the horn and the face of a wolf. On the right were the goddess of love, Maveta, and the god of war, Vine, in armor and with weapons. Millie listened enthusiastically. Then she turned to the priest and thanked him for the story. When he asked her why she was there, she explained that she had come for a magical test. Seeing her smile, which seemed painfully familiar to him, the man froze in surprise. He reached out his hand slightly and muttered Mary Ann's name in confusion. He froze in this movement, as if immersed in memories. The main character looked at him in surprise. Then she muttered awkwardly that she was not Mary Ann. The priest hastily apologized and was about to add something when he was interrupted by a child's cry from behind. Nina ran up to them, saying that she had been looking everywhere for her friend, and she was here, and it was their turn. The main character apologized to the man, said she understood, and hurried after her friend. The priest called after her, asking her to wait. He asked if he had heard correctly that her name was Millie. She turned around as she was walking away and said that Millie was a nickname, and her real name was Mariana Spark. Nina called out ahead of her to hurry up. They needed to rush. Millie nodded, and she disappeared through the door, leaving the priest standing with his hand outstretched in complete confusion. A little later, they ran into the hall for the test. When it was the main character's turn, she reached for the magic ball and, hearing the assessment weak, mentally raised her fist in a gesture of victory. The priest conducting the ritual said that the elemental determination was taking place in another hall and asked her to go there. Millie, happily humming a tune under her breath, thought that it had been worth exhausting her magic until the very last moment. There were many children in the courtyard where the elemental determination was supposed to take place. The priest conducting the ceremony waved his hand, beckoning everyone to him. Millie turned to him and thought confusedly that there was such a crowd here, and keeping so many 5-year-olds under control was no easy task. Then she decided that she needed to get out of there as soon as possible. The priest began to explain the method of determining the element, but the main character was no longer listening, focusing on showing only one of the 4 basic elements. She sighed and gathered her thoughts. She stretched out her arms and, with the most sincere smile, shouted the spell water. A bubble immediately appeared between her palms, quickly growing to the size of a ball. Millie, watching this, thought that such a demonstration should be enough. She lowered her hands and looked at the priest. He stared at her and the result of her magic in shock. The girl became a little nervous and approached him, asking if everything was all right. The priest became embarrassed, fussed about, checked his sheet, and finally announced that, judging by her reaction, her element was water. The main character noted to herself that Joe's element was fire and Marissa's was wind. That was why she chose water, which could be useful to both of them. Finally, the priest handed her a piece of paper with the conclusion about her magic, and the girl happily sang to herself that it was finally over. All that remained was to tell her parents, which meant that now she could openly use water magic in front of them. Humming a tune, she raised her fist in victory, thinking that everything was turning out just fine. At sunset, Millie returned home. Crossing the threshold, she muttered how tired she was after the day. Her parents immediately approached her. Marissa welcomed her home and asked how the test went. The girl approached them and replied that her magical power was weak and her element was determined to be water. Her mother bowed her head slightly and smiled. Then she muttered with embarrassment that it was a pity it wasn't fire, but on the other hand, she was glad that her daughter didn't have so much magical power. Otherwise, it would be dangerous. Joe folded his arms across his chest, looked at his daughter with a smile, and asked why she was grinning. She thought to herself smugly how wrong they were. After all, she could control all the elements. Then Millie suddenly gasped and, conjuring up a water bubble between her palms just like in the test, asked her parents to look at how well she was doing. They froze in shock for a few seconds, not understanding what was happening. Then an enthusiastic Marissa asked admiringly if she could already use magic. Joe immediately agreed with her, confirming once again that their daughter was a little genius. The main character thought to herself that her mission had been a success. Meanwhile, while happiness reigned at the Shady Cat Inn, a different atmosphere prevailed in the church after all the checks were completed. In one of the offices, a familiar high-ranking priest stood pensively by the window. He thought about how many years had passed, probably about 5, and then moaned quietly, wondering why he was left alone in this world. Before he came to the church, he was an assistant to His Majesty Leonardo, the Prime Minister, and worked in the palace. Never before had time passed so slowly. Every day back then was full of hustle and bustle, but he was happy. With these thoughts, he closed his eyes. He remembered the image of that very girl, frozen in his memory forever. He could not even imagine that such a future awaited him. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. The priest who conducted the elemental assessment of 5-year-olds entered. He apologized for the intrusion. Then he approached the senior priest with a stack of papers in his hands and reported that the magical test for today was complete and he had brought the results. The chief priest nodded and thanked him for his hard work. The subordinate continued, laying out the sheets with the results on the table. He said that, as expected, the children of aristocrats had a lot of magical power, but today he had noticed something strange during the elemental assessment of the commoners. The high priest tilted his head questioningly, asking for clarification. Recalling the events of the day, the subordinate explained that he had not even begun to explain the circulation of magical power when one child, a commoner, suddenly used water magic. The senior priest's eyes widened in surprise, and he asked if the child was really able to use magic right away, without any instructions. The junior priest muttered that there had never been such a case before, and that perhaps he was mistaken, because there were so many children today. However, the chief priest did not listen to any further explanations. He immediately asked where the child's data was. The second priest handed him the relevant sheet with the results. The boss's eyes widened again in surprise when he read the familiar name, Mariana Spark. He paused for a couple of seconds, unable to believe that this was a mere coincidence. Could this be the same girl he had encountered earlier in the hall with the statues? Carefully reading the sheet, he muttered her surname, then asked his subordinate aloud if she was related to Baron Edler, who owned magical artifacts. He immediately corrected himself, noting that if she were from that family, she would have passed the check in the hall for aristocrats. He thought to himself that perhaps she had deliberately passed the check as a commoner in order to hide her connection to the aristocracy. The junior priest asked confusedly if everything was all right. Then, answering the question, he apologized and said that he did not know the details of her origin. The chief priest turned back to the window and told him not to worry, adding that he would keep the girl's information for a while. Lost in thought, he wondered why it had to be today. He suddenly remembered that day and the image of the girl, his dear Marianne. Millie looked so much like her. And then, staring into the void beyond the glass, he whispered lostly, "Who is this girl really?" Winter had come to the Shady Cat Inn. And finally, the long-awaited day had arrived. Millie, standing next to Marissa, who was breathing heavily in pain, exclaimed that she was going into labor. Her mother asked her again, barely audibly. Meanwhile, Joe hurried into the room in his street clothes. He quickly apologized, saying he had stopped by the midwife's house next door, but she wasn't home. Marissa turned pale, greatly frightened by this news. Millie, who was anxiously waiting with her father, quietly said that the baby would be born very soon. The door to the room burst open again, and a breathless adult woman, the midwife, rushed into the room. As she ran, she took off her outer clothing, apologizing and explaining that she had just returned from neighboring town. After catching her breath a little, she said that they should leave everything to her now. Joe and Millie exchanged glances, breathed a sigh of relief, and thanked her. The man muttered that everything would be fine, and suddenly began to turn pale, sinking to the floor. The girl cried out in fear. The midwife just waved her hand, reassuring her that everything was fine now, and asked Millie to hug her father, because he needed it now. She nodded decisively. She put a pillow under his head, covered him with a blanket, and sat down next to him. Morning came. Joe sat up, groaning from the heaviness in his head. But as soon as he came to his senses, he immediately shouted his wife's name, looking around in panic, trying to figure out where she was and if everything was okay. The midwife, standing nearby, sighed and smiled, noticing that the man had finally woken up. Then she stepped aside slightly, clearing her view, and said that they had a healthy baby boy and that both the baby and the mother were doing well. Joe finally saw his complete family. Millie was standing by the bed. Marissa was sitting leaning against the headboard, smiling at her husband and holding their tiny, quietly crying son in her arms. Then the girl walked over to her father, took his hand, and congratulated him on the birth of his son. At first, Marissa's eyes welled up with tears. Then Joe himself had tears in his eyes. The father of the family rushed to the bed, picking up his daughter on the way, and hugged her, his wife, and his son tightly, exclaiming through his tears that he was infinitely happy. He carefully took the baby in his arms and said that his wife was a real heroine. Marissa, gently wiping away her tears, murmured words of gratitude, and then added that she was also grateful to Millie. Joe sat down on the edge of the bed, next to his wife, and asked the little girl if she wanted to hold her brother. Millie immediately reached out her arms and exclaimed that of course she did. Then she froze for a second, as if remembering something. She asked him to wait, turned away, and in a slight panic, cast the cleansing spell on her hands and clothes several times. Her father laughed nervously and asked her to stop using magic indiscriminately. The main character ignored his words and again held out her carefully cleansed hands, taking the baby and diligently following the advice to support his head. With a tender, absolutely happy smile, she looked at the boy, and he smiled back toothlessly, clenching his tiny palms into fists and closing his eyes. Millie's eyes widened, and she thought with delight that this boy was simply an angel. The parents watched this scene tenderly for several minutes. Then the midwife, whom everyone had forgotten about, having already gathered her things and gotten dressed, stood at the door and said that she could probably go. Joe immediately rushed over to her and hastily but sincerely thanked her, explaining that he had asked the neighbors, but the midwife was nowhere to be found. He immediately offered to pay her for her help. The old woman bowed her head with a gentle smile and said that she had already been paid. To the family's obvious surprise, she explained that Enrique Rosetta had woken her up and urged her to come, which surprised her greatly. Millie wondered if her grandfather had been involved in this too, but then corrected herself mentally. The main thing was that he hadn't gone too far. She quietly thanked him for his help. Sometime after the midwife left, the whole family gathered around the cradle where the boy was sleeping peacefully and talked quietly. Joe suddenly remembered that they had not yet chosen a name for the child and asked what they would call him. Then he suggested Zeke. Marissa repeated the name, combined it with their surname, and said it was beautiful and strong. Millie nodded happily in agreement. She suddenly remembered how her adoptive parents had once chosen a name for her with the same enthusiasm. How touching and nostalgic it was. Looking at the happy Marissa and Joe, who hadn't stopped smiling all morning, and at her little brother, her eyes sparkled with joy. She thought that today she had officially become a big sister in this world. Several weeks had passed since Zeke's birth. Millie sat on the sofa in her grandfather's office at the Eastern District Trade Guild and thanked him from the bottom of her heart for his timely help. Then, with a slight smile, she remarked that he seemed to be on good terms with that midwife. Enrique laughed and replied that the woman had indeed helped him out a lot. Today, the main character came to patent a recipe for stuffed cabbage rolls that she had recently invented. Joe was not with her. He was in the kitchen preparing a sample of the dish. Enrique suddenly became agitated and began bombarding the girl with questions. How is Marissa doing? How did the birth go? Is she okay? He also added that he had gathered everything he thought was necessary and sent it to them a couple of days ago. Remembering the number of boxes and trunks at home filled with clothes and toys for Zeke, Millie thanked her grandfather aloud and said that they had everything they needed for now. To herself, she thought that this was starting to look like some kind of obsession with his grandson. Then she thanked him again and added with a smile that if he wanted to, he could come visit them himself, which would make them all incredibly happy. Enrique just waved his hand dismissively, saying that if he publicly acknowledged Marissa and Joe's marriage, it would cause a lot of problems. Millie froze grimly after these words, without even taking a sip of tea. With a slight threat in her voice, she said that her mother had been married for a long time. Besides, if his charming great-grandson heard such words, he would surely cry. The man was instantly horrified by this thought. The main character quickly changed the subject. She jumped up, twirled around to show off her new dress, and thanked her grandfather for it and for the cookies. Then she said she wanted to ask him something else. She took a piece of jewelry on a string, resembling an elegant shell, from behind her collar and asked what it was. It was hardly just a necklace. It had been in that very wooden box. Enrique exclaimed in the next second, "Did she break that box?" Millie replied indignantly that she hadn't. She thoughtfully explained that it was a puzzle box and that it was quite difficult to open, remembering how much time she had spent on it. The guild leader crossed his arms over his chest in displeasure, puffed out his cheeks, and asked if she had actually opened it. Then he snorted and admitted that he had assumed she wouldn't be able to do it and would turn to him for help. Millie thought unhappily that this was like kindergarten. Enrique, meanwhile, explained that the necklace was a magical artifact that created a protective barrier when its owner was in danger. Inside was a magic stone. Millie looked at the artifact with excitement and muttered that it was the first time she had ever seen anything like it. Enrique added that the stone was protected by a shell made in the likeness of the very shell that saved the divine beast Bolti when he fell from the heavens. The main character said that now she understood. Then she noticed that the merchant guild had the same item as a talisman. Enrique caught her attention again, explaining that he had given her this artifact in case her power got out of control again. Her magic was dangerous, and if it breaks free, it could harm the girl herself. So she must wear this necklace. Millie looked at her grandfather in surprise. Then she happily thanked him, jumped closer, and hugged him. She promised to take good care of the gift. Enrique nodded slightly embarrassed. Grandfather turned back to his great-granddaughter and noticed that the room had been successfully cleaned up quietly. Millie froze, remembering their unspoken agreement. In exchange for keeping the fact of the fraud within the guild a secret, she had asked them to tidy up the room she had destroyed and not to disclose information about her true magical power. Enrique then continued, saying that the employee who had forged the contract had been handed over to the knights for fraud. However, there were other victims besides Millie. The trade guild would pay compensation to all of them. The girl sat down on the sofa again and smiled happily, saying that this was good news. She happily hummed that it all meant that the incident had been resolved without anyone getting into serious trouble. Enrique looked at her resignedly, put his hand to his forehead, and said that she was still just a child. Then he sighed and muttered that it didn't matter. Suddenly, the assistant to the head knocked on the door. He apologized for the interruption and reported that the head of the Azure Trading Company was requesting an urgent meeting. Enrique exhaled heavily, muttered that there was nothing he could do about it, and asked his subordinate to show the guest into the reception room. Approaching the door, he remembered his great-granddaughter, turned to her, and said sternly that he would be gone for a short time and that she should wait for him in the room. He asked her not to touch anything and, for added emphasis, shook his index finger at her. Millie looked at him tensely and, with a forced smile, gave him a thumbs up, promising to follow his instructions. Enrique looked puzzled at this strange gesture and asked what it meant. But the girl just laughed awkwardly, without answering. Left alone, Millie began talking to herself after a while, complaining that her grandfather had told her to wait. But she was bored, and she had already finished all the cookies. Suddenly, she had an idea. Her grandfather had told her not to touch anything, but she could walk around. She jumped off the sofa, and she began to wander slowly around the office. Stopping at one of the walls, she noticed that there were many paintings and maps hanging there, and she became curious about what was depicted on them. The main character nodded decisively to herself and used her wind magic, gently lifting herself into the air. She quietly exclaimed with delight. She had done it. Now, she would at least be able to see what was hanging high up. A large, detailed map of the Kingdom of Datoria with its capital, Game, particularly caught her attention. The capital was divided into 4 districts. The north was the district of the aristocracy. The east was the district of craftsmen and wealthy citizens. The center was the district of large hospitals and trading companies with a medicinal herb garden, and the south was the factory district of the common people. Looking at this map, Millie tried to find her home, the Shady Cat Inn, and the building of the Trade Guild, where she was now. Then she shifted her gaze to the neighboring map, which turned out to be the second largest city after the capital, the port city of Azure. The girl's face lit up at the thought that there would probably be lots of seafood dishes to be found there. Next, her attention was drawn to the following picture. A portrait of the king of this country. Looking at it closely, Millie froze with the feeling that he reminded her of someone, but she couldn't remember who exactly. Suddenly, voices could be heard approaching from behind the door. One of them thanked the guild leader for accepting him despite his sudden visit. The guild leader replied that he was always happy to help, and the footsteps faded away as they approached the office. Meanwhile, the main character landed gently near the table and rushed back to the sofa. When Enrique entered the room, she was already sitting there with the most innocent expression on her face, peacefully sipping tea from a mug. She greeted her grandfather with a sweet smile, saying she had missed him. Enrique didn't believe this performance for a second. He noticed that something strange was always happening around his great-granddaughter and asked if she had really just been sitting there the whole time. Millie nodded several times, saying that she was an obedient child. After a while, there was a knock at the door. Joe entered. He addressed his daughter, saying that it was time to go and asking how long she had been waiting. Millie took her hat from the table, put it on, and said goodbye to the guildmaster. He nodded, wished her a safe journey, and asked her to take care of Marissa. Then he frowned slightly, and he added quietly that the outfit suited her very well. The main character grabbed the brim of her hat and exclaimed with a broad smile that it was a gift from her grandfather, and it couldn't be otherwise. The man turned away in embarrassment, and Millie thought that her grandfather was such a typical tsundere. And while the visitors were still there, Enrique suddenly remembered something. He said he had been busy with something they had asked him to do, apologized that it had taken so long, but it seemed he would finally be able to introduce them to each other. The main character smiled enthusiastically and thanked the guild leader from the bottom of her heart. A little while later, before the tavern opened, Marissa came down to the common room with the baby in her arms, yawning widely. Millie followed her down, smiled at the scene, and thought that, as she had expected, her mother was not getting enough sleep. Since Zeke was born, Marissa often woke up at night to check on him. And when the main character was just as small, her mother behaved in exactly the same way. Millie remembered being told that Marissa and Joe's first child was a girl named Lisa, who seemed to have died suddenly in her sleep one night. The girl thought sadly as she looked at the woman with dark circles under her eyes, exhausted from lack of sleep, but still gently rocking the baby. Perhaps her mother had become so anxious precisely because she had already lost one child and did not want it to happen again. Millie really wanted Marissa to be able to rest for a while and not worry about the inn. That's how they got a new employee. That day, a boy a few years older than Millie introduced himself as Nate and said that starting today, he would be working at the Shady Cat Inn. He added with a smile that he hoped they would get along. Millie stepped forward, smiling at the boy. Joe stood slightly behind her, arms crossed over his chest, and also greeted him. She remembered that the Trade Guild had recommended several talented candidates to them, and Joe, after conducting several interviews, decided to hire Nate. Returning to the present, Millie folded her arms, touched by the thought that now she wouldn't be the only one cleaning. She thought with admiration that now the Shady Cat Inn could afford to hire a live-in employee. Joe approached the girl and addressed the young man, saying that she was also very happy to see him. He then explained that Millie would teach him everything he needed to know, adding that although she was small, she was very responsible. The main character smiled warmly, introduced herself, and said she was very pleased to meet him. Then Joe laughed awkwardly, scratched his head, and said that as for the room with accommodation, they had all been so busy that they hadn't had time to tidy it up properly. He continued that since there was still time before breakfast, he wanted Nate and Millie to do it together. The main character approached the guy, nodded to her father, accepting the task, and then pointed to the stairs, saying that they could go and get started. As she climbed the stairs, she waved her hand and explained that he could choose any room on the 3rd floor. The new employee thanked her with a smile, his eyes wide with curiosity as he looked around. When they reached the 3rd floor, Millie thought that this floor had always been empty and had not been used until now. That's why she had never been there herself. Then she resolutely opened the door. The entire hallway was covered in cobwebs, a thick layer of dust, and abandoned belongings. The main character immediately slammed the door shut. Frowning, she panicked, thinking that besides dust and cobwebs, there seemed to be mold as well. She couldn't accept this reality. Embarrassed, she muttered an apology and explained that she shouldn't have called him here when it was such a terrible mess. But Nate just smiled broadly, clenched his fists resolutely, radiating cheerfulness, and said he would do his best to clean up. Millie looked at him in surprise and thought that he seemed like a very good person. After a while, the main character sat in the kitchen and muttered wearily that there was an incredible amount of dust. To herself, she thought that she couldn't use the cleansing spell in front of Nate, so she had to do everything by hand, and it was incredibly hard. Joe laughed, ruffled his daughter's hair, said he could see how tired she was, handed her a mug of tea, and thanked them both for their help. Then he grunted and asked which room their new employee had chosen in the end. Millie said she had recommended the largest one, with a wide window, but Nate had chosen another one, the one at the very end of the corridor. She muttered that it would probably be comfortable to live there. An unexpected exclamation interrupted their conversation. Nate took a bite of today's breakfast, an orc cutlet sandwich, and his eyes lit up as he asked what it was. He said it was incredibly delicious and that it was his first time trying it. Joe and Millie, already accustomed to such food, looked at his reaction with only slight surprise. The girl smugly thought, of course, the food at the Shady Cat and was a cut above, or even 2 cuts above, any other tavern. Then the head of the Spark family spoke again. He said that after breakfast, it was time to wash the dishes, and when the children were done, their usual morning routine would await them: laundry or cleaning the rooms vacated by recent guests. After breakfast, Millie and Nate went back up to the 3rd floor. The girl addressed the boy with the respectful prefix "san," but he gently interrupted her, saying that it wasn't necessary because she was his senior comrade here. The main character laughed, picked up a bucket, and said that they could start cleaning right away. She corrected herself, adding that she would take care of the rooms herself, while Nate would take care of the hallway. He picked up a broom, standing nearby, and said decisively that she could count on him. Millie went into the first room and, making sure the guy wasn't looking, began to clean. She muttered that this was her chance. In the next second, she cast the Purify spell several times. In the blink of an eye, the room became spotless. She thought with satisfaction that Purify was a great thing after all. Then, with the most innocent expression on her face, she walked back out, whistling a light melody. Nate turned to her in surprise, muttering that she was very fast, and asked if she was already done. Millie scratched her head awkwardly and laughed, saying that she was just very good at cleaning. She added that she would leave the hallway to him and take care of the other rooms herself. The main character began to dust. Nate stared at her. He noticed that she was so mature and independent. The girl turned to him in surprise. The boy continued, saying that she was only a little older than his younger brother, but already so responsible. Millie asked if he had any brothers or sisters. Without stopping sweeping, he replied that he had an older brother and sister, but they both worked at another restaurant, so now they all lived apart. Nate wanted to become independent so that they could live together again. For a second, his face darkened, and he muttered that he wanted to make it happen as soon as possible. Millie asked with slight concern if something had happened to him. Nate turned to her, apologized, and smiled again, saying that everything was fine, then suggested they continue cleaning. The girl nodded uncertainly. She thought to herself that she had seen a flash of real sadness on the boy's face. Then she decided that maybe she had just imagined it. Several months had passed since Zeke's birthday. Millie was now 6 years old, and Zeke was 6 months old. When a main character looked at her little brother, she couldn't help herself. He was getting cuter every day, especially when he was dressed in a kitten costume and playing with a toy kitten. Joe and Nate were standing nearby. The man said that it seemed like the guy had already gotten used to the job. The guy replied with a smile that it was because Millie was a very good teacher. The girl thought that Nate was a quick learner and had already settled in at the Shady Cat Inn. The guy continued, adding that the best thing here for him was the staff meals, which were simply delicious. For example, today they had fluffy orc croquettes for lunch. Joe laughed amiably and said that it was because his daughter was constantly coming up with new recipes. Millie noted that their menu had also expanded significantly, and regular customers were very happy with the changes. Joe confirmed her words, saying that fortunately, their tavern was indeed thriving. He continued that he could now leave some of the work to Nate with peace of mind, and he was thinking about hiring a couple more people to serve customers. Millie happily said, "Why not?" At these words, Nate looked at them in surprise, then bit his lip tensely and thought for a moment. Joe, noticing this, asked if something was wrong. The guy replied that no, nothing was wrong, thanked him for the food, and said he was going to clean up. The main character looked after him in surprise and thought that Nate looked somewhat depressed. A few days later, the hall was packed with visitors, and there was not a single free table. Suddenly, one of the guests noticed that his change seemed to be wrong. Nate immediately apologized in a panic and rushed to correct the mistake, repeating his apologies several times. The customer said kindly that it was no big deal. It happens to everyone. Millie came over to clear the neighboring table and thought that Nate rarely made mistakes. Then the guy approached her and, apologizing, said he would take the dishes away himself. The girl thanked him. Looking closely, she noticed that Nate had become somewhat distracted and tired since that conversation about hiring new employees. She felt that something was wrong. She walked over to him and called his name. Nate, gathering the dishes, looked at her with his usual smile and asked what she wanted. Millie hesitantly opened her mouth to say something, but Joe called out from behind the counter. He said the orders were ready and asked Nate to bring the dishes quickly. The guy got excited and hurried to fulfill the request. Millie thought that now was not the time to argue. She needed to get back to work. She hoped she had just imagined it. Meanwhile, Nate laughed awkwardly as he picked up several plates from the counter. Suddenly, there was a loud crash. When the main character turned around, Nate was already lying on the floor, barely breathing. Broken plates with orders were scattered around him. The girl rushed to him, and Joe followed her example. A little later, Nate was lying on the bed in his room, where Joe had carried him. He finally came to and found Millie next to him. Sitting up, the guy laughed awkwardly and tried to calm her down. He apologized, saying that he hadn't been sleeping well lately, but now everything was fine and he could move. He tried to get up, but the girl immediately rushed to him and began to wrap him back in the blanket. When he asked her to let him go, she replied that he couldn't get up now and that it was all the fault of the Shady Cat Inn for not taking care of their employees' health. Then she firmly stated that he had to get some proper rest today. Nate laughed again, this time more amiably, and said that only the main character could be so caring. Millie continued seriously, saying that she wanted the Shady Cat Inn to be a place with a transparent, working environment, accidentally using a word from her homeworld. Then, even more resolutely, with shining eyes and complete confidence, she declared that they would do everything in their power to support their dear employees, both current and future. Nate froze in place, his hands folded on top of the blanket, and asked in confusion what she meant by transparent. Millie paused for a couple of seconds, ignoring the question, and then turned to the boy hesitantly. She apologized if she was wrong, but ever since her father had mentioned increasing the number of employees, she had felt that something was bothering him. She suggested that perhaps this was the reason for his lack of sleep. Nate fell silent, tense, and Millie realized she was right. She continued, saying that the guy always worked so hard and was very attentive to details. Since he had joined the team, he had been a great help to the Shady Cat Inn. His father, mother, and even she herself all considered Nate an important part of their business. Then she took his hands and squeezed them tightly, saying that if he had any problems, they would all help him. The guy thanked her with emotion, and his eyes glistened slightly. A few days later, the entire Spark family and Nate gathered in one room. Marissa sat near the crib, Millie and Joe sat on the sofa, and Nate sat on the second sofa across from them. He folded his hands in front of him and thanked them all awkwardly for taking the time to see him. Joe folded his arms across his chest and kindly told him to calm down. The guy nodded and continued. It turned out that he did indeed have a younger brother and sister, 10-year-old Kate and 5-year-old Mark. They now work together in the same restaurant, but they are treated very badly there and have been asking their older brother for advice and help for a long time. At these words, Joe's face darkened. He asked seriously where they worked. He heard in response that it was at Manga. Millie froze for a few seconds. She remembered that awful encounter with the owner, who had once demanded the recipe for orkatsu from them. Could it be that the children were working for such a person in that dreadful establishment? Nate began to tell her that he had secretly visited the restaurant the other day to check on the younger ones. They were forced to work until they dropped, and, according to their stories, they were made to work late into the night and then clean the entire establishment. Then, with barely concealed anger, the boy added that some customers had recently started harassing his sister. At these words, Marissa and Joe exchanged heavy glances, their faces becoming even more stern. Millie grimaced, unable to comprehend how this was possible. They were just a 10-year-old girl and a 5-year-old boy. It was disgusting, and the customers in that place were probably terrible. Joe, tense and serious, asked the guy if he knew the terms of their contract. After all, if the contract had been officially signed, it would be very difficult to take Kate and Mark away before it expired. Nate replied that there was no official contract, because otherwise they would have had to pay them a fixed salary. Besides, Mark had only recently turned 5, so it seemed that he didn't have a written contract at all. After all, he was higher when he was still 4. And in order to work legally in this country, it is necessary to conclude an employment contract. The trade guild controls such things as setting minimum wages and drawing up contracts. Usually, it is not possible to conclude an official employment contract with children under the age of 5. At all this, Millie folded her arms across her chest, filled with discontent and almost rage. It turned out that Kate and Mark had been working in completely inhumane conditions. Then she asked Nate about their parents. The boy turned away and began to tell her. His mother died shortly after Mark's younger brother was born, and soon after, his father remarried. But his stepmother began to cruelly abuse Kate and Mark. Nate himself had already left home and was working, and their father simply ordered the two of them to work at Manga. Joe frowned and asked if their father had said anything about the lack of a formal contract. Nate quietly replied that he hadn't, and then explained. In fact, the reason even his 5-year-old brother ended up there was because their father had simply sold both children to Manga to get rid of the burden. He uttered these last words with particular fury, his voice trembling with overwhelming emotion. Millie frowned seriously, looking at the boy with deep sympathy. Nate continued, adding that even if his younger siblings ran away, they would simply have nowhere to return to. Joe exchanged glances with his daughter and summed up. So the boy's father had forced the children to work against their will and made some kind of deal with the owner of Manga behind their backs. The main character confirmed this, saying that the owner of the establishment probably just wanted cheap and obedient workers. Tears welled up in Nate's eyes, but he firmly stated that he was already 16 and could now become the official guardian of his younger siblings. Therefore, he wanted to take them away from there. Millie remembered that when they talked about hiring new employees, he was probably thinking about his brother and sister, and was afraid that it would cause extra trouble for the Shady Cat Inn. That was the reason for his silence. Suddenly, Joe got up from his seat and sighed heavily, indicating that he understood everything. He walked across the room toward the young man. Everyone present watched his actions with surprise. Nate awkwardly apologized again for making them listen to all this. Suddenly, Joe slapped him on the back and, with a broad, encouraging smile, told him to bring his brother and sister as soon as possible. Marissa and Millie looked at this scene with tenderness. Nate looked up at the man uncertainly and asked in a doubtful voice if it was really okay to do that. Joe nodded confidently. Then he went over to his wife and said that since they were the sister and brother of their employee, they could trust them with the job with peace of mind. Marissa smiled brightly and nodded in agreement, saying that they had been planning to hire new employees anyway. Nate had been struggling alone for so long, and now he had people who were willing to help him. These thoughts and the relief he felt brought tears to the young man's eyes again. He didn't try to hold them back, wiping them away with his sleeve and warmly thanking the entire Spark family. The whole couple came over to him. Joe patted him on the shoulder, Marissa sat down next to him on the edge of the sofa, and Millie sat down on the other side and gently stroked his arm. When the guy calmed down a little, Joe leaned over to him and said that since everything had been decided, they needed to hurry. He announced that the work for today was done and they should get moving. Nate thanked them all again, this time more firmly. The main character's father thought to himself with dissatisfaction that the owner of the tavern was clearly a dubious character, so it would be better to hire security just in case. That same evening, a familiar adventurer, Mr. Zach, came to the tavern. Joe greeted him, saying he was glad to see him. Zach replied with a friendly smile that he had already heard about their situation and asked them to leave the security issues to him. He said there was no need to worry about payment. He was happy to help in such a matter. The father of the family then said that this adventurer had appeared at just the right moment. But was he sure of his decision? Zach laughed and confirmed it, explaining that a dangerous kidnapper had recently appeared in the area. He had been assigned to investigate, so he would be staying in the area anyway. Then Zach turned to the main character and said that, according to rumors, the kidnapper had not yet been caught, so she should be especially careful. The girl nodded seriously in agreement. Then the adventurer turned to Nate and said they could go. Millie stood up decisively, mentally concluding that they were going to Manga. Thus began the operation to rescue Nate's sister and brother. So, to save Nate's sister and brother, they headed for that tavern. Millie walked to the exit door and grabbed the handle. At that moment, her father grabbed her, asking where she was going. Was she really going with Zach and Nate? Millie still reached for the door, confident that she would go with them. But her father, with a firm but kind smile, said that she would stay home, and that was final. The girl turned to him with a look of disappointment on her face and asked why. Joe replied that it would be dangerous, so she couldn't go. It was obvious. Zach interrupted their conversation. He awkwardly but kindly told her not to worry, that he and Nate would definitely bring her younger siblings back. Millie looked at the adults irritably and thought that they probably thought she would only cause them problems. Then she sighed, resigned to the situation, and thought that there was nothing she could do about it, and she would have to trust Zach with the matter. Meanwhile, the adventurer approached Nate and said that they could move on. Nate nodded eagerly in anticipation. The main character, standing in the doorway, called out to the guy and wished him luck and a safe journey. Nate turned around and raised his clenched fist with a confident smile, full of determination. Several hours passed, and it was already dark. The entire Spark couple sat in the common room, mechanically tidying up and waiting for their return. Millie thought tensely that Nate and Zach should be back soon, as she had hoped. Then the door opened. Mr. Zach appeared in the doorway, announcing that they had returned. Nate followed him in, looking back with a gentle, happy smile. He softly told his younger siblings, his brother Mark and sister Kate, that they had arrived. Millie looked at the children with sympathy and horror. They clung fearfully to Nate, trying to stay as close to him as possible. Their hands and faces were covered with scratches, bruises, and abrasions that spoke volumes about how they had been treated all this time. The main character smiled as she jumped up to the children and welcomed them home. She explained that they were just about to have dinner and invited everyone to sit down together. Then she ran to the table. She picked up a plate of apple chips and, returning, handed it to the children with the friendliest smile. They looked at each other uncertainly and looked at their older brother. Nate leaned over to them and gently said they could try some. Kate and Mark cautiously took a piece, took a bite, and their eyes instantly lit up with surprise. They murmured that it was incredibly delicious. Millie watched their reaction tenderly. Then she introduced herself as the owner's daughter and held out her hand. She said she was very pleased to meet them. The children, a little embarrassed, shook her hand. The adults watched the scene with smiles. A little later, when everyone was sitting down to dinner, Joe took Mr. Zach to the kitchen to discuss how everything had gone. He thanked the adventurer for his help, and Zach, folding his arms across his chest, said he was glad that everything had been settled peacefully. When Joe handed him a cup of tea, Zach began to tell his story. When he and Nate arrived at the tavern, it was already closed and the owner was not there. Only the owner's wife and son were inside. Nate approached them and introduced himself as Kate and Mark's brother, politely asking to meet the younger ones. The owner's son grumbled discontentedly that they were busy preparing for the next day and that they should get lost. Nate tried to insist, saying that he just wanted to see them, but they began to rudely chase them away. Watching this argument, Zach could no longer stand it. He pushed the man aside, apologizing gruffly for his abruptness, and threw open the door leading into the back of the room. The owner's son stammered, asking who he was, but Zach ignored him. He began to call out loudly for Kate and Mark, saying that their brother had come to see them. For a few seconds, there was silence. Then a quiet, timid knock came from one of the doors. The adventurer approached it and immediately realized that the door was locked from the outside. Using his sword, he cut through the chain, threw open the door, and saw two frightened, crying children. The older girl was shielding the little boy with her body. They had been locked in a small, almost empty room. Zach reached out to the children, telling them they could go now. But at that moment, the tavern owner's son jumped up to them and shouted, "What right did they have to take his employees?" He swung his arm and blurted out that the girl, Kate, was his fiancée. Zach quickly grabbed his arm. He twisted it and pressed the rowdy man sharply against the wall. In a threatening voice, he warned that if the man continued to cause trouble, he would immediately call the guards, and then everyone would be in trouble. The man muttered something indistinctly, but did not resist any further and let them go. Zach finished his story. Joe, listening with his arms crossed over his chest, muttered that it was a good thing he had asked Mr. Zach to accompany Nate after all. Nate himself, approaching them, added bitterly that it seemed the owner of that tavern had arbitrarily declared Kate his son's fiancée, forcing her to work for free. He usually kept her locked up, letting her out only during working hours. Then the boy bowed his head and said sadly that they should have rescued the younger ones much earlier. Noticing this reaction, Millie tugged at her father's sleeve, as if reminding him of something. Joe nodded. He said that before the situation became even more complicated, he wanted to formally sign an employment contract with Kate and Mark. He asked Nate if he had any objections. The boy looked at the man with emotion. Barely containing his emotions, he replied that no, of course, he agreed. Millie looked at her father with a grateful smile. So Kate and Mark had been living at the Shady Cat Inn for a week. Soon they began to recover from their ordeal and looked much better. And all thanks to this support. Although they were still far from ready to start work, Joe and Millie immediately decided to make everything official. To do this, they all went to the guild together. Now, they were safe. At least, that's what Millie thought, until a certain day. Suddenly, in the middle of the day, the tavern door flew open. The owner of Manga entered the hall. He shouted menacingly for Kate and Mark to come out to him immediately. Joe went out to the owner of the Manga and said seriously, but politely that, unfortunately, the man would not be able to meet with those he was looking for. He added that he was disturbing his customers and asked him to leave. After these words, the henchman who had come with the owner began to kick the furniture with a bang, scattering everything around and shouting furiously. They moved further into the hall. and the owner of Mankaputii shouted furiously, asking who was the thief who had taken his employees away. How dare he? Joe raised his voice in response, taking a step forward. He told them not to talk nonsense, because they had never treated Kate and Mark as real employees. Suddenly, one of the patrons, an adventurer, intervened in their argument, addressing the owner as Old Man. This made the vein on his bald head bulge, and he furiously asked what he had been called. The adventurous guy also lost his temper and said that if the man wasn't going to eat, he should leave. The other patrons immediately joined in, shouting that the adventurer was right, that the noise would make the food taste bad, and demanding that the uninvited guests leave. The man frowned fiercely. Then he turned abruptly and headed for the exit, saying as he left that Joe would return his former employees to him anyway. Millie watched the whole scene in confusion, standing near the stairs, but did not dare to come closer so as not to get in the way. After the uninvited guests left, Joe approached the visitors and bowed apologetically, thanking them for standing up for him. The adventurer waved his hand with a smile, saying that it was no big deal and that there had been bad rumors about Mankaputii for a long time, so the shady cat and was just unlucky to get involved with him. Suddenly, Millie heard muffled crying from the upper floor. She rushed upstairs, worried about Kate and Mark. She threw open the door to their room and found the children on the floor. Kate was hugging her younger brother tightly, covering him with her body. The main character shouted their names. The children turned to her with tears in their eyes. Millie looked at the scene with concern. Then she knelt down in front of them and gently hugged them both. She said in a quiet but firm voice that everything was fine now and no one would hurt them. She felt how badly Kate was shaking. And pure, cold rage flared in her heart. How could adults intimidate a child like that? She would never forgive that old crook for that. Millie quickly went downstairs and, on the way, shouted to her father that she was going out for a moment to sprinkle salt on the threshold for purification. Joe wanted to ask her again or even forbid her to go out after everything that had happened, but his daughter had already disappeared behind the door. The main character moved away from the tavern and began to look around. She thought that those people clearly hadn't had time to return to Mankaputii yet. Suddenly, in one of the alleys, she noticed familiar figures, the very ones who had caused the riot. Making sure no one was following her, Millie used the wind spell. She silently climbed onto the roof of the nearest house. No one would notice her there. She frowned as she looked at the group below and thought that these people would be perfect for testing the magic she had recently mastered. As soon as the men stopped to discuss something, Millie cast the darkness spell. They were instantly enveloped in an impenetrable dark dome. The girl mentally explained that thanks to the soundproofing effect of dark magic, no one would hear their cries now. Seeing the result, she inwardly exclaimed with satisfaction. Then she decided to start with water magic. She created several large water balls, and she carefully moved them right onto the head of the owner of Mankaputii. His henchmen watched in horror as their boss choked and swore wildly, trying to understand what the hell was going on. In a moment, the dome of darkness dissipated. The men, wet and confused, began to look around nervously. Millie, meanwhile, watched them from above with a cold smile. Then she took aim and fired several tiny but scorching hot flames, precisely singeing the eyebrows of each of them. They screamed in fear and pain, slapping their faces unsuccessfully, trying to extinguish the fire. They cried out that it was unbearably hot. What was going on? Millie smiled broadly as she listened to their cries. Compared to how Kate and Mark had suffered, these men got off very lightly. Then she whispered that perhaps they had had enough for today, but that this wasn't the end, and let them run away in panic. And then she thought she should practice controlling her magic a little more. It was useful. A little later, at Mankaputii, the innkeeper drank something strong from a mug in a rage, then threw it on the table. He shouted, cursing, asking what the hell that was, and added that the bastard from the shady cat and had completely lost control. Suddenly, he heard footsteps behind him, and his son entered the room. The man grumbled that he was finally back, and asked if he had submitted the contract to the guild. The boy awkwardly hesitated, looking away. He replied that, as his father had instructed, he had tried to submit the contract with forged signatures from Kate and Mark. But he was told that the children already had a valid employment contract, and they refused to accept the new one. He tried to find out which establishment the contract was with, but the guild flatly refused to say. The boy was interrupted by his father, who took another sip and shouted that it was obvious it was the shady cat inn. Taking a new mug with dissatisfaction, he grumbled that the Sparks were meddling in his business, and he wouldn't rest until he made them pay. Suddenly, it dawned on him. That bastard from Shady Cat and had a daughter. At this thought, a nasty, predatory grin spread across his face. After that lunch skirmish with the people from Mankaputii, Joe became much more cautious and hired adventurers to stand guard at night. During the day, their restaurant was often visited by regular customers, the same adventurers. So if anything happened, they would surely help. Anyway, the main character, with her child's body, couldn't stay awake at night, so this was a big help. And so, in such a tense situation, when it seemed that villains were hunting her around the clock, it became a little scary. Once, Millie and her friends, Mike and Nina, went for a walk in the woods near their house. Two men with singed eyebrows and clearly beaten down by life watched them from around the corner with openly malicious faces. When Mike noticed them, he stood up and called out to the main character, asking who they were. Nina, clutching the wreath she had just woven in her hands with fear, added that they had been looking in their direction for a long time. Millie snorted as she approached and said that they were probably pedophiles. Mike asked her again. The girl hugged Nina and waved her hand at him, explaining that that's what they call perverts. And when they started to leave, the men who were about to follow them were caught by a sudden strong gust of wind and spun around on the spot. Seeing this, Millie smiled smugly. A little later, back at Manga, the men who had been following Millie, barely able to move their legs and supporting each other, approached the bar. They called out to the boss and said they couldn't go on, and then one of them hysterically added that if anyone approached that girl, something bad would definitely happen. Every time they go to the Shady Cat Inn, something bad happens. The tavern owner didn't even turn to face them. He just muttered over his shoulder that it was all nonsense, took a sip from his mug, and continued stirring the food in the pan. He asked how long they could keep fussing over one girl. His employees rushed to interrupt each other, trying to convince him that it was true and that even just approaching the Shady Cat Inn meant risking injury. The tavern owner sighed irritably, calling them useless. Then he transferred the food to a plate, put it on the table, and muttered that he had just had a brilliant idea. He added grimly that he would take care of the rest himself. A few days later, late at night, Millie came downstairs from her room, sleepy, to get a drink of water. Yawning widely, she thought it was strange. These villains had come tirelessly every day and then suddenly stopped. She drove them away with magic every day, but such sudden silence also bothered her. Suddenly, she heard a suspicious noise from below. She hid around the corner, not quite reaching the bottom, and peeked out cautiously, wondering if a guest had returned so late. Then she heard the night watchman, an adventurer, tell four men that, unfortunately, they were no longer accepting guests at this hour. He apologized and asked them to leave. Suddenly, one of the men approached him and pulled a small but heavy club from his sleeve. He struck him on the head with all his might. The adventurer collapsed silently to the floor, unconscious. Millie watched in horror. Looking closely, she realized that one of the men was the owner of Manga himself, and the others were apparently his hired men. The leader, the one who had knocked the guy out, took off his hood, revealing a scarred face. He said that the people they had come for were on the third or fourth floor. They needed to be quiet because it would be unpleasant if the other night watchman discovered them. Then another mercenary, grinning nastily, said that the wife of the owner of this tavern was rumored to be a real beauty, and if he found her, would he be able to have some fun with her? The chief mercenary smiled, pulled out a dagger, and, turning to the owner of the Manga, said that he would return his former employees to him, and that they would do whatever they wanted with the rest. The owner of the Manga grinned nastily and nodded in agreement. He added that the two children from the Shady Cat Inn should be captured and sold into slavery. While the four men discussed the details in hushed tones, Millie quietly slipped around the corner and pressed her back against the wall. She thought that this time the nasty old man had brought other people with him, and they looked like experienced, dangerous thugs. She didn't want anyone to get hurt. They had to be stopped somehow. Then the main character waved her hands, figuring that her magic should reach them from this distance. She peeked out again and, trying to remain unnoticed, mentally cast the spell Earth. She had to set a trap for them. Sharp, albeit small, spikes grew on each step of the staircase. The chief mercenary reminded his men, who were moving toward the stairs, not to make any noise. One of them mockingly asked him not to worry. He put his foot on the first step, and when he stepped on it, he cried out loudly in pain. He immediately covered his mouth with his hand and began rubbing his pierced foot with the other. The scarred chief mercenary hissed at him menacingly and whispered furiously that he had ordered them not to make any noise. Then he summoned a small ball of light, illuminating the stairs, but there was nothing there. Fortunately, Millie had managed to remove the spikes, so no one noticed anything. The chief mercenary sighed heavily and said that there was nothing there, waving his hand for them to move on. And they didn't waste any time. The main character frowned at the fact that they had no intention of giving up. Since that was the case, she decided to act differently. She cast the darkness spell on the other two mercenaries who were already climbing the stairs ahead. They froze for a few seconds in complete, impenetrable darkness, not understanding what was happening. One of them tried to summon light, but the spell didn't work. Inside the sphere of darkness, his magic was useless. Millie sat on her knees, her hands folded in front of her, thinking of only one thing, that her magic would be enough. She made a mental promise to herself. She would never again let anyone lay a finger on her precious family. Meanwhile, the mercenary trapped in the sphere of darkness was still trying unsuccessfully to summon light. He cursed, not understanding why nothing was working. Suddenly, a strange rustling sound came from ahead, and the second mercenary asked in panic what the sound was. The first muttered that he didn't know because it was completely dark around them and ordered a retreat. The chief mercenary heard these words. He rushed to the door, trying to open it, but nothing worked. He nervously exclaimed that the door was jammed. It simply wouldn't budge. Muttering that it was as if the earth itself was preventing him from turning the handle, he shouted to the others that there was no way out. The window was also blocked, as if it had been bricked up. One of the mercenaries muttered in confusion that he didn't understand what was going on. At that moment, something grabbed him. It knocked him to the floor with force, immobilizing him. He tried to shout something but couldn't. The second mercenary, trying to free him, exclaimed that the ropes were as hard as stone and wouldn't budge. Meanwhile, the mercenary who remained on the stairs tried again to summon the light. This time he succeeded. He breathed a sigh of relief, directed the light upward, and saw a huge, black, hairy spider in front of him. His legs buckled with fear, and he fell headlong down. The chief mercenary cried out in horror and panic, "What kind of monster is this? And where did it come from?" Then he cursed and asked furiously, "Wasn't this supposed to be a piece of cake?" Millie laughed silently as she watched how she had managed to scare them so much. The chief mercenary heard her quiet laughter. He looked up the stairs and saw the girl there. Rage flared up in him, and he shouted, "Is this all we're doing?" The main character ran away, but she hadn't taken more than a few steps when the man caught up with her and grabbed her, squeezing her arm so hard that her bones cracked. The chief mercenary roughly grabbed Millie by the arm and lifted her up, growling that she had mocked them enough, and now she would pay for it. The girl cried out in pain. She turned to him and demanded in a firm tone that he let her go. The man only snorted contemptuously in response and declared that he was taking her with him. The main character began to warn him menacingly, but her words were interrupted. Suddenly, the bandit felt a strange, tickling sensation on his skin. He looked down and was horrified to discover hundreds of tiny black spiders crawling over his arms and legs. In a panic, he threw Millie away, shaking his limbs wildly and screaming that they wouldn't come off. The girl fell, hit her head, and groaned in pain. At that moment, the voice of the owner of Manga rang out. Pale and frightened, he declared that he was leaving immediately. The main character, overcoming her dizziness, got up. She mentally ordered the huge magical spider to block the exit. The man barely managed to dodge the hairy paws and shouted that she was a cheeky little girl. Millie just frowned in response. The spider pinned the scoundrel to the floor. She wrapped him in strong stone ropes. She thought she would never forgive him for the threat he had brought upon her home. The owner of Manga began to struggle in vain to free himself, demanding to be released. In response, Millie summoned the wind. The surge of magic made her hair stand on end. She easily jumped over the railing and descended softly. She shouted that he was getting what he deserved and hit him with a clump of magical water right in the face. The man choked and began to suffocate, his body shaking with convulsions. Through his wheezing, he barely managed to utter a plea to stop. When his resistance finally weakened, Millie sank to the floor and exhaled heavily, wiping the sweat from her forehead. The silence that followed the noise of the struggle seemed deafening. Then the girl picked up one of the tiny spiders on her finger and mentally thanked them for their help. Thus, Operation Arachnophobia, carried out with the help of earth magic, was successfully completed. A faint groan came from behind her. Millie turned around and rushed to the fallen adventurer. He was still unconscious. In this situation, it was even for the best. All she had to do was remove the soundproof sphere of black magic and, with the help of wind magic, slightly distort her own voice. The main character cleared her throat, and with all her might, she screamed for help. The guests began to wake up to the noise, not understanding what was happening. Joe, hearing his daughter's voice, instantly jumped up. Marissa, holding Zeke close, rushed after him. Nate also woke up in his room. Everyone began to slowly make their way downstairs, frozen in bewilderment. The adventurers who were the first to arrive were stunned by what they saw. Unfamiliar men lying on the floor in strange positions. Regardless of the reason, it was clear that the guards needed to be called immediately. Joe and Marissa came down next. They were frantically calling out their daughter's name, asking where she was. Millie peeked around the corner and told her father that she was there and had just gone to the bathroom. Her parents rushed to her and hugged her tightly. murmuring words of relief and gratitude to heaven. Joe, his voice trembling, added that when he couldn't find her in her room, he almost died of fear. Nate was the last to come downstairs. He looked around in confusion and froze when he recognized one of the bound men as the owner of Manga. Panic flashed across his face, and he began to mutter to Joe that it was all his fault because of his problems. The whole Spark couple frowned and almost simultaneously shouted that he was not to blame at all. Then Joe, calming down, exhaled and said that the main thing was that they were all safe and sound. In the morning, a knight arrived to investigate the case. Bart. He stood in the hall, questioning the owners and guests of a shady cat inn. Everyone confirmed that, upon hearing the scream, they had gone downstairs and found the robbers lying unconscious. Then the knight turned to the girl, clarifying that it was she who had left the room that night. He asked her name. The main character introduced herself by her full name and nodded in agreement. The knight asked if she had heard anything suspicious. Millie replied that she had only heard a cry for help, but she was so scared that she hid the whole time. She mentally noted that during the confrontation, she had used black magic for soundproofing, so she was able to pretend that, like everyone else, she had not heard the voices of the robbers. While they left her alone, she thought that the guards should believe that the adventurers on duty had defeated the attackers themselves, even though they couldn't remember the details due to their injuries. Knight Bart muttered in confusion that he didn't understand what had happened here at all. His subordinate added that he had tried to question the detainees, but they were just muttering something incoherent about spiders in a panic. Bart continued, addressing his colleague, that the owner of Manga didn't even seem to realize the gravity of his crime, colluding with wanted criminals. This was far beyond petty mischief. Hearing this, Millie thought that these criminals must be the ones Zack had mentioned earlier. Bart added that reports indicated their possible presence in the Eastern District, but he did not expect them to be captured in such a strange way. Millie watched the conversation with genuine interest. Bart noticed this. He looked at the girl intently, with displeasure. She froze in confusion, thinking that things were bad. Their eyes had met. Millie immediately put on her most innocent face and stepped aside. The knights finished their inspection and headed for the exit. The younger one stumbled and asked the older one if he had noticed anything strange. The older one closed his eyes for a moment and replied that no, there was nothing unusual and that it was time for them to go. After they left, the main character froze in place. It seemed to her that they had suspected her of something after all, but in any case, the matter was now closed. She laughed quietly with relief. When she calmed down, she returned to reality. Her gaze fell on the dilapidated room, and then a new thought struck her. What to do with all this now? To be continued. Thanks for watching. Write your feedback in the comments. If you like the story, please like and subscribe. See you soon.